Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Take a moment to settle in. Let your breathing slow and allow yourself to sink into the steady rhythm of documentation, where every case becomes a story told in the measured language of police reports. The typewriter keys had a particular sound in the quiet hours of the night shift, each letter striking the paper with a soft metallic tap that created its own kind of rhythm. Sergeant Patricia Wolf had grown accustomed to this sound over her 12 years of service, the way it marked time in the otherwise fluid hours between midnight and dawn. Her desk sat in the corner of the main office, positioned so she could see both the front entrance and the corridor that led to the holding cells. But tonight the building held only the peaceful stillness that came with a quiet Tuesday in late autumn. Before her lay a stack of incident reports that needed to be reviewed, filed, and properly categorized for the permanent record. Each report represented hours of careful observation and documentation, the transformation of human drama into the precise language that police work required. Sergeant Wolf had developed a deep appreciation for this process over the years, understanding that these reports served as more than administrative requirements. They were attempts to capture truth in a form that could be preserved, analyzed, and learned from. The first report in her stack dealt with a vandalism incident at Jefferson Elementary School. Officer Morrison had responded to a call from the school principal, who had arrived Monday morning to find that someone had spray-painted messages on the exterior wall of the gymnasium. The report described the scene with methodical precision, noting the exact location of each message, the type of paint used, and the approximate height at which the words had been applied. Reading through Officer Morrison's careful documentation, Sergeant Wolf could visualize the scene exactly as he had found it. The messages were not random graffiti but coherent statements, expressing frustration with school policies and what the unknown writer described as unfair treatment of students. The handwriting, though rendered in spray paint, showed evidence of education and careful thought, suggesting that this was not the impulsive action of a troubled youth, but the deliberate expression of someone with specific grievances. Officer Morrison had photographed each message before beginning his investigation, creating a permanent record that would allow future analysis if similar incidents occurred. His report noted that the paint was still slightly wet when he arrived, suggesting that the vandalism had occurred sometime after midnight, when the school grounds would have been empty and unobserved. The investigation had proceeded with the kind of methodical patience that characterized Officer Morrison's approach to all his cases. Rather than treating the incident as simple property damage, he had taken the time to read and analyze each message, looking for clues about the writer's identity and motivations. The messages spoke of specific incidents involving teachers and administrators, suggesting that the writer had intimate knowledge of the school's internal workings. Sergeant Wolf found herself drawn into the quiet detective work that Officer Morrison had documented. He had interviewed school staff about recent disciplinary actions, policy changes, and personnel decisions that might have prompted such strong feelings. The principal had mentioned a controversy over the cancellation of several after-school programs due to budget constraints, a decision that had disappointed many students and parents. The breakthrough in the case had come through patient observation rather than dramatic investigation. Officer Morrison had noticed that one of the messages referenced a specific incident that had occurred during a school board meeting the previous week, an incident that had not been reported in local newspapers or discussed publicly. This suggested that the writer had been present at the meeting or had heard about it from someone who was there. Working with school administrators, Officer Morrison had obtained a list of everyone who had attended the school board meeting, cross-referencing it with students, parents, and school staff who might have had access to the building after hours. This methodical approach had eventually led to the identification of Robert Chun, a graduating senior who worked part-time as a custodian and had been deeply involved in the after-school programs. That had been eliminated. The resolution of the case had been handled with the same thoughtfulness that had characterized the investigation. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, Officer Morrison had worked with school administrators to arrange a meeting between Robert and the school board, providing an opportunity for the young man to express his concerns through appropriate channels rather than through vandalism. The final report documented this meeting, noting that Robert's articulate presentation of student concerns had led to a reconsideration of some of the budget cuts and the restoration of several popular programs. The school board had also implemented new procedures for student input on policy decisions, recognizing that the vandalism incident had highlighted a gap in communication between administrators and the students they served. Sergeant Wolf found this case representative of the kind of police work that often went unnoticed but played a crucial role in maintaining community harmony. Officer Morrison could have simply filed charges and closed the case, but his decision to look beyond the immediate crime to its underlying causes had led to a resolution that strengthened rather than damaged the relationship between the school and its students. Next report dealt with a noise complaint at the Riverside Apartments, a complex that housed mostly young professionals and college students. Officer Davis had been called to investigate reports of loud music and shouting coming from apartment 3B, where a party was apparently in progress despite the weeknight hour and the complex's noise policies. Officer Davis had approached the situation with characteristic patience, first speaking with the complainants to understand the scope and duration of the problem before confronting the party hosts. His report documented conversations with Mrs. Martinez in 3A, who had been awakened by loud music and voices in the hallway, and Mr. Thompson in 3C, who described the noise as ongoing for several hours despite his attempts to resolve the situation by speaking directly with his neighbors. The report described Officer Davis's careful observation of the scene before taking action. He had noted that while music was indeed playing at a volume that exceeded reasonable nighttime levels, the gathering appeared to be celebratory rather than destructive, with well-dressed guests who seemed to be enjoying a milestone event rather than simply partying without purpose. His conversation with the party hosts, Jessica and Michael Rodriguez, had revealed that they were celebrating Jessica's graduation from law school and her acceptance of a position with a prestigious local firm. The celebration had begun as a small dinner party but had grown as friends and family members arrived to congratulate the new graduate. The couple had been unaware that their celebration was disturbing neighbors and were immediately apologetic when Officer Davis explained the complaints, rather than issuing citations or demanding an immediate end to the gathering. Officer Davis had worked with the hosts to find a compromise that respected both their desire to celebrate and their neighbors' need for sleep. The music was turned down to a reasonable level. Guests were asked to move their conversations inside rather than continuing them in the hallway and stairwells, and the party was scheduled to end within the hour. The report included follow-up notes documenting Officer Davis's return visit 30 minutes later to ensure that the agreement was being honored. He found that the party had indeed wound down to a quieter level, with most guests having departed and the remaining celebrants confining their conversations to the apartment itself. More significantly, Officer Davis had used the opportunity to facilitate better communication between neighbors who had previously been strangers. His report documented an impromptu introduction between Jessica and her neighbors, leading to apologies for the disturbance and invitations for Mrs. Martinez and Mr. Thompson to join the celebration for a brief toast to Jessica's achievement. This kind of community mediation represented police work at its most effective, transforming a potential source of ongoing conflict into an opportunity for neighbor-to-neighbor relationship building. Officer Davis had recognized that the noise complaint was symptomatic of a larger issue involving communication and mutual consideration within the apartment complex. and his intervention had addressed these underlying concerns rather than simply enforcing noise ordinances. Sergeant Wolf turned to a report that documented a more complex investigation, one that had required sustained attention over several weeks. Detective Anderson had been assigned to investigate a series of thefts from lockers at the Municipal Recreation Center, where personal belongings had been disappearing from supposedly secure storage areas during busy afternoon hours when the facility was crowded with after-school and after-work users. The initial reports had seemed to indicate random opportunistic theft, with items of varying value being taken from different areas of the locker room at unpredictable times. Detective Anderson's first report described the challenge of investigating crimes that occurred in a space with constantly changing occupancy, where dozens of people might have access to any given area during the course of an afternoon, rather than approaching the investigation as a traditional theft case. Detective Anderson had chosen to study the recreation center as a social environment, spending hours observing the patterns of use and the informal social dynamics that governed behavior in shared spaces. His reports read like anthropological studies, documenting how different groups of users interacted, how peak usage times affected security and supervision, and how the physical layout of the facility created opportunities for both legitimate use and potential criminal activity. The detective had interviewed facility staff extensively, learning about the routines and procedures that governed daily operations. The custodial staff had provided valuable insights into which areas of the building were most isolated at different times of day, while the front desk personnel had noticed patterns in when thefts were reported and how different types of users secured their belongings. Detective Anderson's breakthrough had come through patient observation rather than dramatic confrontation. He had noticed that thefts seemed to cluster around the times when youth athletic programs were transitioning between activities, creating periods of confusion and minimal supervision that might provide opportunities for someone familiar with the facility's routines to operate undetected. Working with recreation center staff, Detective Anderson had implemented what his report described as enhanced observational protocols during these transition periods, rather than obvious surveillance. This involved having staff members position themselves in areas where they could maintain natural oversight of locker room access while appearing to be engaged in routine duties. Strategy had proven effective within a week, when a staff member observed 16-year-old Marcus Williams entering the adult locker room during a time when he should have been in the youth area preparing for basketball practice. Williams had been using his knowledge of the facilities, routines, and his status as a regular participant in recreation programs to gain access to areas where he could search through belongings, while their owners were occupied with athletic activities. Resolution of the case had followed the thoughtful pattern that characterized much of the police work documented in these reports. Rather than simply arresting Marcus, Detective Anderson had worked with recreation center staff and the teenager's family to understand the circumstances that had led to the thefts. Marcus had been struggling with financial pressures at home and had convinced himself that taking small items from the lockers of what he perceived as wealthy adult users was a victimless crime. Detective Anderson's final report described a comprehensive resolution that addressed both the immediate crime and its underlying causes. Marcus was required to return all stolen items and make restitution for anything that could not be recovered. More importantly, he was connected with a counseling program that helped him understand the impact of his actions on his victims and develop more appropriate ways to address his family's financial difficulties. The recreation center had also implemented policy changes based on Detective Anderson's investigation, improving locker room security and creating better supervision during program transitions. These changes had been designed to prevent future incidents while maintaining the open welcoming atmosphere that made the facility an important community resource. Reading through these detailed reports, Sergeant Wolf was struck by the amount of time and attention that officers like Detective Anderson were able to devote to seemingly minor cases. The theft of personal belongings from recreation center lockers might not have seemed significant compared to more serious crimes. But Detective Anderson's thorough investigation had revealed important insights about security, supervision, and the social dynamics that could either prevent or facilitate criminal behavior in community spaces. The next report in her stack dealt with an incident that had initially appeared much more serious than it actually was. Officer Kim had responded to a call about a suspected break-in at the offices of Henderson Insurance, where an employee arriving early for work had found a door unlocked and evidence that someone had been in the building. Overnight. Officer Kim's initial report described a scene that suggested possible commercial burglary, with desk drawers opened and papers scattered in several offices. However, her careful examination of the scene had revealed inconsistencies that suggested a different explanation for the apparent disruption. The officer had noticed that while papers were indeed scattered, they appeared to have been sorted rather than simply ransacked. Office supplies remained untouched, and valuable equipment like computers and calculators had been left undisturbed. Most significantly, the building's security system showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that whoever had been in the building had legitimate access. Officer Kim's investigation had proceeded with careful attention to these details, focusing on finding explanations for the evidence rather than assuming that a crime had necessarily occurred. Her interviews with Henderson Insurance employees had revealed that several staff members had keys to the building, and that it was not uncommon for people to work unusual hours during busy periods. The solution to the mystery had emerged through patient questioning of employees about their recent work schedules and any projects that might require after-hours access to client files. Sarah Henderson, the owner's daughter who worked as an accountant for the firm, had eventually admitted that she had been in the office overnight working on a complex audit that required access to files from multiple clients. Sarah had been reluctant to admit her presence in the building because she had been working on personal time without authorization from her father, hoping to complete the project before he discovered how behind schedule she had fallen. Her unauthorized overtime had involved extensive research through old files, which explained the scattered papers and open drawers that had initially suggested a break-in. Officer Kim's final report documented the resolution of the incident with characteristic thoroughness, noting that no crime had actually occurred, and that the business owner had been grateful for the careful investigation that had prevented false insurance claims and unnecessary concern about security breaches. The case illustrated the importance of thorough investigation, even in situations that might seem straightforward. A less careful officer might have concluded that a burglary had occurred based on the initial evidence, potentially leading to false reports and misallocated investigative resources. Officer Kim's attention to detail and willingness to question initial assumptions had prevented these complications while also revealing family and workplace dynamics that the business owner might want to address. Sergeant Wolf found herself impressed by the consistent quality of investigation and documentation that characterized all these reports. Officers like Kim, Anderson, Davis, and Morrison clearly understood that their job involved more than simply responding to incidents. They were gathering information that would be used to understand patterns, prevent future problems, and maintain the detailed records that effective law enforcement required. The next report dealt with a domestic disturbance call that had required multiple visits and careful mediation. Officer Rodriguez had been called to the Patterson household 3 times in 2 weeks, each time to address conflicts between family members that had escalated beyond normal disagreement to the level where neighbors felt compelled to call police. The first report described a situation involving Patricia Patterson, her adult daughter Maria, and Maria's boyfriend James, who had been living in the family home since losing his job several months earlier. The conflict centered around household responsibilities, financial contributions, and what Patricia described as disrespectful behavior that was making life difficult for everyone in the house. Officer Rodriguez had approached each call with patience and careful attention to the concerns expressed by all parties. His reports documented extensive conversations with each family member, conducted privately to allow everyone to express their feelings without the immediate pressure of confrontation with the others. The picture that emerged from these interviews was one of good people struggling with a difficult situation that was testing everyone's patience and understanding. Patricia Patterson was a widow trying to maintain stability in her household while dealing with the stress of supporting additional adults on her fixed income. Maria was caught between loyalty to her mother and her boyfriend, trying to maintain family harmony while also supporting James through his period of unemployment. James himself was dealing with the frustration of job loss and the embarrassment of being dependent on his girlfriend's family for housing and support. His behavior, which Patricia experienced as disrespectful, seemed to stem from his own feelings of inadequacy and his discomfort with his current situation rather than from any genuine disregard for her or her household. Officer Rodriguez had worked with the family over several visits to develop what his reports described as a household management plan that addressed everyone's concerns and established clear expectations for behavior and responsibilities. James was required to contribute to household expenses through unemployment benefits and to spend a specified number of hours each week actively searching for employment. The plan also established guidelines for shared use of common areas, quiet hours that respected Patricia's need for rest, and a timeline for James to find alternative housing once his employment situation improved. Most importantly, Officer Rodriguez had helped the family establish regular meetings to discuss issues before they escalated to the comedy level that required police intervention. Final report in the Patterson case documented a follow-up visit that Officer Rodriguez had made several weeks after implementing the household management plan. He found that the family had successfully maintained the agreements they had made, with James having found part-time employment and begun looking for his own apartment while maintaining better relationships with both Maria and her mother. Patricia Patterson had expressed gratitude not just for the immediate resolution of the conflicts, but for the process that Officer Rodriguez had used to help the family understand each other's perspectives and work together toward solutions. His patient approach had transformed what could have become an ongoing source of police calls into an opportunity for family growth and improved communication. These domestic cases represented some of the most challenging aspects of police work, requiring officers to serve as mediators, counselors, and social workers in addition to their law enforcement duties. Officer Rodriguez's success with the Patterson family demonstrated the importance of understanding that many situations that came to police attention were symptoms of larger social and economic problems rather than simple behavioral issues. Sergeant Wolf turned to a report that documented an investigation into suspicious activity at Riverside Park, where several residents had reported seeing individuals conducting what appeared to be drug transactions during evening hours when the park was supposed to be closed to public access. Officer Thompson had been assigned to investigate these reports and determine whether criminal activity was actually occurring. The initial surveillance that Officer Thompson had conducted confirmed that people were indeed meeting in the park after hours. But his careful observation had revealed that the activity was different from what the reports had suggested. His documentation described watching individuals arrive separately, meet briefly, exchange small packages, and then leave. Behavior that could indeed suggest drug transactions, but might have other explanations, rather than making immediate arrests based on suspicious behavior. Officer Thompson had chosen to conduct extended surveillance to better understand the pattern of activity he was observing. His reports described weeks of patient observation, documenting the times when meetings occurred, the number of people involved, and the specific locations within the park where the activity was concentrated. Breakthrough in understanding what was actually happening had come when Officer Thompson observed one of the regular participants dropping a small package during what appeared to be a routine exchange. Rather than immediately confronting the individuals involved, he had waited until they left and then retrieved the dropped item to examine its contents. The package had contained not drugs, but homemade food, carefully wrapped and labeled with handwritten notes. Further investigation had revealed that the supposed drug transactions were actually an informal food-sharing network organized by members of the local homeless community, who used the park as a meeting place to distribute meals and resources to those in need. Officer Thompson's final report described his conversation with the group organizers, learning about their efforts to provide support for community members who were struggling with hunger and housing insecurity. The after-hours meetings had been chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention to participants who might be embarrassed about needing assistance or who were concerned about their safety in more public settings, rather than disrupting this community support network. Officer Thompson had worked with park administrators and social service agencies to find ways to accommodate the food sharing program while addressing the safety concerns that had prompted the original complaints. The resolution involved establishing official hours when the park could be used for community support activities, along with improved lighting and security measures that made the area safer for all users. The case demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation before taking action in situations that might not be what they initially appeared to be. Officer Thompson's patient approach had prevented the disruption of a valuable community service, while also addressing legitimate concerns about after-hours park usage and safety. Reading through these reports, Sergeant Wolf was consistently impressed by the level of care and attention that officers brought to their documentation. Each report told a complete story, capturing not just the immediate facts of incidents, but the broader context that helped explain why things had happened and how they had been resolved. The reports also revealed the variety of skills that effective police work required. Officers needed to be investigators, mediators, social workers, and community organizers, often within the context of a single case. They needed to understand human psychology, family dynamics, economic pressures, and social systems, using this knowledge to develop solutions that addressed underlying problems rather than just their immediate symptoms. The next case file dealt with a vandalism incident at the public library, where someone had been systematically damaging books by tearing out pages and writing in margins. Librarian Susan Chun had contacted police after discovering that dozens of books had been affected over a period of several weeks, with the damage concentrated in specific sections of the collection. Detective Johnson had approached the investigation by analyzing the pattern of damage to understand what might motivate someone to target library materials in this way. His report noted that the vandalism was not random, but seemed focused on books dealing with specific topics, particularly those related to local history and government policies. The detective had worked closely with library staff to understand the circulation patterns and usage statistics that might provide clues about when and how the vandalism was occurring. The damage was being discovered during routine shelving activities, but the books were being returned to circulation with torn pages and defaced text, suggesting that the vandalism was happening while the books were checked out rather than while they were on library shelves. Detective Johnson had reviewed circulation records for all the damaged books, looking for patterns in who had checked them out and when the damage might have occurred. This analysis had revealed that many of the affected books had been checked out by the same library patron during the period when the vandalism was taking place. The investigation had led to Robert Morrison, a local resident who had been researching property tax policies and zoning decisions as part of a dispute with the city over proposed development near his home. Morrison had been using library resources to research the history of similar decisions and had become frustrated with what he perceived as biased or incomplete information in the official records. Detective Johnson's report described Morrison's explanation that he had been correcting what he saw as errors and omissions in the books, adding information that he believed was being deliberately suppressed by local officials. He had not considered his annotations to be vandalism, but rather as contributions to the historical record that would help other researchers understand the full context of local political decisions. The resolution of the case had involved extensive discussion between Detective Johnson, library administrators, and Morrison himself about appropriate ways to contribute to community knowledge without damaging shared resources. Morrison had agreed to pay for the damaged books and to work with library staff to develop alternative ways to share his research with other community members. The library had also implemented new procedures for community members who wanted to contribute historical information or research materials, creating opportunities for supplemental information to be made available without damaging the existing collection. Morrison had eventually become a volunteer researcher, helping the library develop more comprehensive local history resources that incorporated multiple perspectives on controversial topics. This case illustrated how vandalism investigations sometimes revealed legitimate grievances or community needs that could be addressed through constructive alternatives to property damage. Detective Johnson's patient approach had transformed a property crime into an opportunity for community education and civic engagement. The final report in Sergeant Wolf's stack dealt with a noise complaint that had required ongoing mediation over several months. The Riverside apartment complex had been experiencing repeated conflicts between residents over noise levels, parking assignments, and shared facility usage, with the problems escalating to the point where police were being called several times each week. Officer Martinez had been assigned to work with apartment management to develop a comprehensive approach to these ongoing problems, rather than simply responding to individual complaints as they arose. He had conducted what his report described as a community assessment, interviewing residents throughout the complex to understand the full scope of the issues and the various perspectives on potential solutions. The report documented Officer Martinez's discovery that the noise complaints were symptoms of larger problems related to overcrowding, inadequate soundproofing, and lack of communication between residents who came from different cultural backgrounds and had different expectations about community living. Young professionals who worked irregular hours were coming into conflict with families who needed predictable, quiet times, while cultural differences in approaches to hospitality and socializing were creating misunderstandings about appropriate behavior in shared spaces. Working with apartment management and a mediator from the Community Dispute Resolution Center, Officer Martinez had organized a series of community meetings that allowed residents to discuss their concerns and work together to develop guidelines for community living that respected everyone's needs and cultural backgrounds. The process had required months of patient work, with Officer Martinez serving as both facilitator and enforcer as residents gradually learned to communicate with each other and developed mutual understanding about shared expectations. His reports documented the slow but steady progress as noise complaints decreased, and residents began to resolve conflicts through direct communication rather than police intervention. The final report noted that the Riverside apartment complex had become a model for community policing approaches to residential conflicts, with other apartment complexes requesting similar interventions to address their own ongoing problems with neighbor disputes. Officer Martinez had developed what he called a community harmony protocol that could be adapted to different residential settings, providing a framework for preventing conflicts before they escalated to the level requiring police response. As Sergeant Wolf finished reviewing the last report in her stack, she reflected on the consistent themes that emerged from all these cases. Effective police work seemed to require patience, empathy, and creativity in equal measure, along with a willingness to look beyond immediate symptoms to understand underlying causes of community problems. The officers whose work was documented in these reports had clearly understood that their role extended beyond traditional law enforcement to encompass community building, conflict resolution, and social support. They had used their authority not to impose solutions but to facilitate communication and cooperation between community members who were struggling to live together peacefully. Each report represented hours of careful observation, thoughtful analysis, and patient work to develop solutions that addressed the needs of everyone involved. The documentation itself served as a form of institutional memory, preserving knowledge about what approaches worked and why, creating resources that could guide future officers facing similar challenges. The typewriter keys had fallen silent now, the reports properly filed and categorized for the permanent record. But the stories they contained would continue to inform police work for years to come, providing examples of how patient, thoughtful law enforcement could strengthen rather than strain the social fabric that held communities together. In the quiet hours before dawn, Sergeant Wolf found deep satisfaction in this work of documentation and preservation, knowing that these careful records would serve as both historical document and practical guide for the ongoing effort to maintain justice, order, and community harmony in an increasingly complex world. The sub-basement of the records division stretched deeper than most people imagined, its corridors extending into sections that hadn't been visited in months, sometimes years. Archivist Margaret Reeves moved through these forgotten spaces with the reverence of someone who understood that she was the guardian of more than just paper and ink. Each cabinet, each shelf, each carefully labeled box contained fragments of human experience preserved in the amber of official documentation. The fluorescent lights in this section flickered occasionally, casting moving shadows that seemed to breathe life into the stillness. Margaret had grown fond of these imperfections over her 23 years in the archives. The newer sections upstairs had perfect lighting and climate control. But down here, in the oldest part of the collection, the building itself seemed to acknowledge the weight of history it contained. She paused at Section M, where files from the 1970s rested in metal cabinets that showed their age in small dents and scratches, each mark a testament to decades of careful use. The drawer she opened released the familiar scent of old paper, that particular mixture of dust and time that she had come to associate with stories that had found their peace. The first file she retrieved contained reports from a missing person case that had captured the community's attention during the summer of 1974. The initial report, typed on paper that had acquired a sepia tone with age, described the disappearance of 8-year-old Timothy Walsh from a neighborhood block party. The case had mobilized every available officer and volunteer in what became one of the most extensive search efforts in the department's history. Detective Frank Morrison, whose name appeared on dozens of reports from that era, had approached the case with methodical precision that was evident even in these faded documents. His initial assessment noted that Timothy was a responsible child who would not ordinarily wander away from supervised activities. suggesting that his disappearance was either the result of an accident or potential abduction. The search had begun immediately, with officers canvassing a gradually expanding radius around the Walsh family home. Margaret could trace the progression of the investigation through the reports, each one documenting another area searched, another witness interviewed, another lead pursued with the patient thoroughness that characterized Detective Morrison's work. The case files contained hand-drawn maps showing the search grid, with different areas marked as they were systematically covered by teams of officers and volunteers. These maps, created with rulers and colored pencils, represented hundreds of hours of careful documentation, each square indicating that someone had walked every foot of ground looking for any trace of the missing boy. Reading through witness statements that had been taken in the days following Timothy's disappearance, Margaret could feel the community's growing anxiety. Neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area, though none of these sightings led to significant leads. Parents spoke about their own fears, their increased vigilance with their children, the way the disappearance had changed the atmosphere of a neighborhood where children had previously played freely. Without constant supervision, the breakthrough in the case had come not through dramatic detective work, but through the kind of patient observation that characterized the best police investigations. Officer Janet Chun had been conducting routine follow-up interviews 3 days after Timothy's disappearance when she spoke with Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 6 blocks from the Walsh family. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned hearing what sounded like a child crying in the storm drain system that ran beneath her property. She had initially dismissed the sound, thinking it might be cats or simply the acoustics of water flowing through the tunnels. But Officer Chun had taken the report seriously enough to investigate. The storm drain system was extensive, connecting properties throughout the older section of the neighborhood through tunnels that dated back to the 1940s. Most residents were unaware of the complexity of this underground network, which created spaces where a lost child might wander and become disoriented or trapped. Officer Chun's report described her methodical exploration of the accessible portions of the storm drain system, working with city maintenance crews who had maps and keys to the various access points. The search had required crawling through spaces barely large enough for an adult, calling Timothy's name and listening for any response that might guide them to his location. They had found Timothy huddled in a dry section of the tunnel system, scared and hungry but physically unharmed. His account of how he had ended up in the drains revealed the kind of innocent curiosity that could lead children into dangerous situations. He had been playing hide and seek during the block party and had discovered an open maintenance access in someone's backyard. Crawling into what he thought would be the perfect hiding place. Once inside the tunnel system, Timothy had become disoriented and lost, unable to find his way back to the entrance he had used. He had wandered through the tunnels for hours before exhaustion forced him to stop and wait for rescue. The sound that Mrs. Patterson had heard was indeed Timothy crying. His voice carried through the tunnel system to emerge near her property, several blocks away. The resolution of the case had been documented with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized the investigation. Timothy was reunited with his family, examined by medical personnel to ensure he had suffered no lasting harm from his underground ordeal, and gently questioned to help authorities understand how the incident had occurred and how similar situations might be prevented in the future. The case files included follow-up reports documenting the city's decision to install better security on storm drain access points throughout the neighborhood, preventing other children from accidentally discovering these underground passages. The Walsh family had written a letter of gratitude to the police department, particularly praising Officer Chun's persistence and Detective Morrison's coordination of the search effort. Margaret found something deeply moving about the way this case had been resolved through patient, methodical work rather than dramatic action. The reports revealed a community that had come together in crisis, supporting each other through days of uncertainty and celebrating together when Timothy was found safe. She returned the Walsh file to its proper place and selected another thick folder, this one containing documentation of an art theft investigation that had unfolded over several months in 1976. Case had begun when the curator of the Municipal Art Gallery reported that several valuable paintings had been replaced with skilled forgeries, a discovery made only when experts were brought in to authenticate works for a traveling exhibition. Detective Sarah Williams had been assigned to the case, and her reports revealed an investigation that required understanding both criminal behavior and the specialized world of art authentication and sales. The initial challenge had been determining when the theft had occurred, since the forgeries were sophisticated enough that they had hung undetected in the gallery for an unknown period. Detective Williams had worked with art experts to understand the techniques used in creating the forgeries, learning about the specific materials and methods that would be required to produce such convincing replicas. Her reports documented visits to art supply stores, conversations with local artists and art teachers, and consultations with experts who could explain the various ways that paintings might be copied or forged. The investigation had revealed that the theft was not the work of random criminals, but required someone with significant knowledge of both art and gallery security procedures. The forgeries were too sophisticated to be the work of amateurs, and the thief had somehow gained access to the paintings long enough to create detailed studies that would be necessary for such accurate reproduction. Detective Williams had focused her investigation on individuals who had both artistic skills and access to the gallery, including staff members, volunteer docents, and artists who had been involved in previous exhibitions. This approach required delicate handling, since many of these individuals were respected members of the arts community who might be offended by any suggestion that they could be involved in criminal activity. The breakthrough had come through financial investigation rather than art expertise. Detective Williams had noticed that one of the gallery's part-time security guards, Robert Martinez, had recently made purchases that seemed beyond his modest salary, including a new car and expensive art supplies for what he described as a personal hobby. Further investigation revealed that Martinez had been using his security access to photograph the paintings in detail, creating reference materials that he used to produce forgeries during his off-duty hours. He had been replacing the original paintings with his copies gradually, selling the authentic works through contacts he had developed in neighboring cities where the stolen pieces were less likely to be recognized. The case files contained photographs of Martinez's apartment, which had been converted into a sophisticated art studio with professional lighting, easels, and a collection of art books and reference materials. Detective Williams had documented the discovery of additional forgeries in various stages of completion, along with detailed photographs and notes that Martinez had used as guides for his reproductions. Resolution of the case had required cooperation between multiple jurisdictions to recover all the stolen paintings, some of which had already been sold to collectors who had no knowledge that they were purchasing stolen goods. Detective Williams had worked with art dealers and auction houses to trace the movement of the stolen works, eventually recovering all but one of the original paintings. Martinez had been prosecuted not only for theft, but for fraud related to the sale of forged artwork. The case had led to improvements in gallery security procedures and better protocols for authenticating works in the permanent collection. The art community had also implemented better communication systems for sharing information about stolen works and suspicious sales. Margaret found the case fascinating for its intersection of traditional police work with specialized knowledge about art and cultural institutions. Detective Williams had needed to become something of an expert herself in art authentication and the art market, demonstrating the intellectual flexibility that effective police work often required. The next file dealt with a more complex case involving a series of break-ins at local businesses during the winter of 1978. The pattern had initially seemed random, with burglars targeting establishments as diverse as a bakery, a hardware store, and a dry cleaner. Detective Robert Johnson had been assigned to investigate what appeared to be unrelated crimes committed by different perpetrators. Detective Johnson's reports revealed his systematic approach to analyzing the crime patterns, looking for connections that might not be immediately obvious. He had created detailed charts showing the locations, times, and methods used in each break-in, searching for patterns that might reveal whether the crimes were related or simply coincidental. The analysis had revealed subtle connections that might have been missed by a less thorough investigation. All the burglaries had occurred during specific weather conditions, always during or immediately after snowstorms, when visibility was reduced and fewer people were likely to be on the streets. The methods of entry were similar across different locations, suggesting that the same individuals might be responsible for crimes that had initially appeared unrelated. More significantly, Detective Johnson had noticed that the stolen items followed a pattern that suggested specific knowledge about each business. The burglars had taken cash from registers, but had also targeted specific merchandise that would be valuable and easy to resell, avoiding items that might be difficult to dispose of or that would be easily traceable. The investigation had required extensive surveillance and community cooperation to identify the perpetrators. Detective Johnson had worked with business owners to establish better security procedures while also organizing informal neighborhood watch activities that increased the likelihood that suspicious activity would be observed and reported. Case had been solved through a combination of improved surveillance and community vigilance. During the next snowstorm, several alert citizens had reported seeing individuals moving between buildings in the business district during the early morning hours when the area should have been empty. Police response had led to the arrest of 3 young men who had been systematically targeting businesses during weather conditions that provided natural cover for their activities. The investigation had revealed that the burglars were local residents who had been unemployed since the closure of a major manufacturing plant several months earlier. They had turned to crime not from any predisposition toward criminal behavior, but from desperation about their financial situation and frustration with their inability to find legitimate employment. Detective Johnson's final reports documented his work with social services and employment agencies to address the underlying economic problems that had contributed to the crime spree. The 3 men had been prosecuted for their crimes but had also been connected with job training programs and financial assistance that addressed the root causes of their criminal behavior. The case illustrated how economic conditions could create crime patterns that required law enforcement to work beyond traditional policing roles. Detective Johnson had recognized that preventing future crimes required addressing community economic health as much as improving security measures or increasing patrols. Margaret selected another file, this one containing documentation of a fraud investigation that had required months of patient financial analysis. The case had begun when several elderly residents reported receiving calls from individuals claiming to represent various utility companies, charities, and government agencies, asking for personal information or requesting immediate payment for supposed emergencies. Detective Linda Thompson had been assigned to investigate these reports, which initially seemed like isolated incidents but gradually revealed themselves as part of a sophisticated fraud operation targeting vulnerable community members. The challenge was that the victims often felt embarrassed about being deceived, making them reluctant to provide complete information about their experiences. Detective Thompson had approached the investigation by working closely with social service agencies and senior citizen organizations to understand the full scope of the problem and to create safe spaces where victims could report their experiences without feeling judged or embarrassed. Her reports documented extensive outreach efforts designed to build trust with potential victims and their families. The investigation had revealed a complex operation involving multiple individuals who used various techniques to identify and target elderly residents who might be susceptible to their schemes. The fraudsters had researched their targets carefully, gathering information about their family situations, financial circumstances, and personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited in their deceptive approaches. Detective Thompson had worked with phone company investigators and federal authorities to trace the calls and identify the individuals responsible for the fraud operation. This required understanding telecommunication systems and financial networks that extended beyond local jurisdiction, demonstrating the increasingly complex nature of modern criminal investigations. The case had been resolved through coordinated action by multiple agencies, resulting in the arrest of 7 individuals who had been operating what prosecutors described as a criminal enterprise, specifically designed to exploit elderly community members. The investigation had recovered thousands of dollars that were returned to victims, though many had suffered losses that could not be completely recovered. More importantly, Detective Thompson's work had led to the development of education programs designed to help elderly residents recognize and avoid similar schemes in the future. She had worked with community organizations to create workshops and informational materials that empowered potential targets with knowledge about how fraud operations worked and what warning signs to watch for. The case files included letters from grateful family members who credited Detective Thompson's educational efforts with protecting their elderly relatives from subsequent fraud attempts. The program she had developed became models for other communities dealing with similar problems, demonstrating how effective law enforcement could extend beyond prosecution to include prevention and education. As Margaret continued through the archives, she selected a file dealing with a missing person case that had tested the limits of traditional investigation techniques. The case involved Maria Santos, a 22-year-old college student who had disappeared while walking home from her evening job at a local restaurant, leaving no trace despite extensive searches and investigation. Detective William Chun had approached the case with methodical persistence, beginning with comprehensive interviews of everyone who had seen Maria during her final day. His reports documented conversations with her coworkers, classmates, family members, and acquaintances, creating a detailed picture of her routine and relationships that might provide clues about her disappearance. The investigation had revealed that Maria was a responsible student with no history of risky behavior or involvement in activities that might have put her in danger. She worked regular hours, maintained good grades, and had close relationships with family and friends, who would have been immediately concerned if she failed to return home as expected. Detective Chen had organized extensive searches of the area between Maria's workplace and her apartment, working with volunteer groups and K-9 units to cover every possible route she might have taken. The searches had expanded over days and weeks to include larger areas, abandoned buildings, and remote locations where someone might have taken her or where she might have sought shelter if she had become lost or injured. The case had remained unsolved for several months, with Detective Chun continuing to follow up on tips and pursue new leads even as the initial urgency faded and other cases demanded attention. His reports documented his persistent efforts to keep the investigation active, recognizing that missing person cases often required extended effort and that new information could emerge at any time. The resolution had come through an unexpected source when Maria herself had contacted police from a shelter for domestic violence victims in a city 300 miles away. Her story revealed that she had been abducted by someone she knew, held against her will for several days, and had eventually managed to escape when her captor became careless about security measures. Maria had chosen not to return home immediately because she feared that her abductor might attempt to find her if she resumed her normal routine. Instead, she had sought help at a domestic violence shelter, explaining her situation to counselors, who had helped her develop a safety plan and contact authorities in a way that would protect her from further harm. Detective Chun's final reports documented the arrest of Maria's abductor and the careful process of ensuring her safety during her return home and the subsequent trial. The case had highlighted the importance of maintaining active investigations even when initial leads had been exhausted, and the need for law enforcement to understand the complex psychology of abduction and escape. Margaret found the case remarkable for Detective Chun's persistence and for the way it challenged assumptions about how missing person investigations should be conducted. The case had influenced department policies about maintaining long-term investigations and had contributed to better training about the psychology of abduction victims. The archives contain thousands of such cases, each one representing not just criminal investigation, but human drama, community concern, and the patient work of officers who understood that their job was about more than simply enforcing laws. These files were repositories of wisdom about human nature, community dynamics, and the complex social systems that could either support or undermine public safety. Margaret moved deeper into the archives, selecting files from different eras and different types of cases, each one contributing to her understanding of how police work had evolved while maintaining consistent themes about patience, community engagement, and thorough investigation. The dust continued to dance in the amber light, and the silence held the weight of all these completed stories, their urgency long since transformed into the peaceful satisfaction of justice served and problems resolved. In this deep sanctuary of the archives, every case had found its rest, every question had been answered, every mystery resolved. The files waited patiently in their proper places, ready to offer their lessons to future investigators who would face similar challenges and who would benefit from the accumulated wisdom of officers who had walked these paths before them. The archives themselves were more than storage. They were libraries of human experience, temples of patience and persistence, monuments to the quiet heroism of public servants who had dedicated their careers to understanding and serving their communities. In the stillness and dust and amber light, these stories lived on, their lessons preserved for those who would continue the work of maintaining justice, order, and peace in an ever-changing world. As Margaret prepared to return the files to their proper places, she reflected on the privilege of serving as guardian of these stories. Each file represented not just completed police work, but preserved memory, institutional knowledge that would inform future decisions and guide future officers facing similar challenges. The archive stretched on into darkness, containing more stories than any single person could read in a lifetime, more wisdom than could be easily cataloged or summarized. But each file was carefully preserved, properly maintained, ready to offer its insights when they were needed. In the quiet of the deep archives, time moved differently, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the slow accumulation of cases resolved, problems solved, communities served. The dust motes continued their ancient dance, carrying whispers of the past into an uncertain future, preserving the knowledge that effective police work was really about understanding people and helping them find ways to live together safely and peacefully. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, casting their imperfect illumination over the careful order of the archives, where every story had found its place and every case had found its piece. Here, in the deepest level of the records division, the accumulated wisdom of generations of police work waited in patient silence, ready to guide and inspire those who would continue the endless work of serving and protecting their communities. The county courthouse stood silent against the pre-dawn sky, its limestone facade weathered, by decades of seasons, but still maintaining the dignified bearing that had marked it as the center of justice for the community since 1952. Night security officer James Walsh made his rounds through corridors that held different meanings in darkness than they did during the busy daylight hours when lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and families filled these spaces with the urgent drama of ongoing cases. In the quiet hours, the building seemed to breathe with the accumulated weight of all the cases that had found their resolution within these walls. Each courtroom held its own particular atmosphere, shaped by years of careful proceedings, thoughtful deliberations, and the patient work of ensuring that justice was served with both fairness and compassion. Officer Walsh paused outside courtroom 3, where Judge Margaret Patterson had presided for the past 18 years, with a reputation for thoroughness and wisdom that had earned respect from both prosecutors and defense attorneys. The heavy wooden doors were closed now, but beyond them lay the space where countless cases had found their peaceful conclusions through careful application of law and equity. The morning docket from the previous day still rested on the clerk's desk, documenting cases that had been resolved with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all proceedings in Judge Patterson's courtroom. Officer Walsh had observed many of these sessions during his 15 years of courthouse security, developing deep appreciation for the careful process through which conflicts were transformed into resolutions. The first case on yesterday's docket had involved Robert Morrison, a local businessman who had been charged with tax evasion after an investigation that revealed discrepancies in his financial reporting over several years. The case had required extensive documentation and analysis of business records, with both prosecution and defense working to establish the facts about Morrison's intent and the extent of any violations. Officer Walsh remembered the quiet dignity with which the proceedings had been conducted. Morrison had appeared with his attorney, clearly nervous but determined to accept responsibility for his mistakes while hoping for understanding about the circumstances that had led to his financial difficulties. His small construction company had been struggling during an economic downturn, and his attempts to manage cash flow had led to decisions that crossed the line from aggressive accounting into illegal tax avoidance. The prosecution had presented their case with careful attention to the evidence while acknowledging that Morrison's violations appeared to stem from business difficulties rather than deliberate criminal intent. The defense had documented the economic pressures that Morrison's company had faced, along with evidence of his previous good character and his contributions to the community through various charitable activities. Judge Patterson had taken time to consider all aspects of the case before announcing a sentence that balanced accountability with recognition of the circumstances that had contributed to Morrison's violations. He was required to pay substantial fines and penalties that would make full restitution to the tax authorities, but he avoided jail time in recognition of his cooperation with the investigation and his lack of prior criminal history. The resolution had also included provisions for Morrison to work with financial advisors to establish better accounting practices and to submit to periodic reviews to ensure ongoing compliance with tax obligations. Judge Patterson had noted that the goal was not simply punishment, but education and prevention of future violations. Officer Walsh had observed Morrison's relief at the sentence, but more importantly, he had seen the man's genuine remorse and his commitment to rebuilding his business practices on a foundation of complete legal compliance. The case had concluded with Morrison expressing gratitude for the fairness of the proceedings and the opportunity to make amends for his mistakes. Moving past courtroom 3, Officer Walsh continued to courtroom 1, where Judge Robert Chun handled many of the more complex civil cases that required extensive deliberation and careful weighing of competing claims. The atmosphere in this courtroom was different, shaped by proceedings that often involved years of preparation and multiple parties with legitimate but conflicting interests. Previous day's session had concluded a property dispute that had required months of testimony and evidence review. The case involved 3 families who had inherited adjacent properties from a relative, whose will contained ambiguous language about boundary lines and shared access rights. What could have become an bitter family feud had been resolved through patient mediation and careful legal analysis. Officer Walsh had observed portions of this case over many months, watching as attorneys for all parties worked with Judge Chun to develop solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate needs while maintaining family relationships that had been strained by the legal proceedings. The resolution had involved detailed surveying of the properties and the establishment of easements that ensured fair access while clarifying ownership boundaries. The families involved had expressed satisfaction with the outcome, noting that Judge Chun's patient approach had helped them understand each other's positions and find solutions that preserved both their legal rights and their family bonds. The case had concluded with agreements about ongoing communication and shared responsibility for maintaining the properties in ways that benefited everyone involved. Officer Walsh reflected on how different these quiet resolutions were from the dramatic courtroom scenes often portrayed in popular media. The real work of the courthouse was characterized more by patience and careful analysis than by confrontation and surprise revelations. The justice served in these halls was built on thorough preparation, respectful dialogue, and genuine concern for finding solutions that served the broader interests of community harmony. He continued his rounds to the basement level, where the holding cells waited in silent readiness for the few occasions when they were needed. These small, secure spaces were designed for temporary detention of individuals awaiting hearings or serving brief sentences, but they were rarely occupied during the quiet, overnight hours. The cells themselves spoke to a different approach to incarceration than might be found in larger facilities. They were clean and well-maintained, with attention to basic dignity and comfort within the constraints of security requirements. Officer Walsh took pride in ensuring that anyone who spent time in these facilities was treated with respect and provided with necessities, like clean bedding, adequate meals, and access to reading materials. The overnight logbook documented the occasional use of these facilities, usually for individuals who were detained for minor violations and released after brief stays. Officer Walsh remembered Maria Santos, who had spent one night in custody after being arrested for driving with a suspended license. Rather than simply processing her through the system, the arresting officer had worked with court personnel to understand the circumstances that had led to her license suspension and to develop a plan for resolving her legal status. Maria had lost her license after accumulating parking tickets that she couldn't afford to pay due to a period of unemployment. The unpaid fines had led to suspension, but she had continued driving because her job required transportation and she had no alternatives for getting to work. Her arrest had brought the situation to the attention of court officials who were able to work with her to establish a payment plan and restore her driving privileges. The case had been resolved through community service rather than additional fines, with Maria working with local nonprofit organizations to provide services that benefited the community while allowing her to maintain employment. Officer Walsh had observed her return to the courthouse several months later to complete her community service obligation and to thank court personnel for their assistance in resolving her situation constructively. These kinds of interventions represented the courthouse at its best, using legal authority not simply to punish violations, but to address underlying problems that created recurring issues for community members who were struggling with economic or social difficulties. The goal was to strengthen rather than strain the social fabric that held the community together. Asterisk. Officer Walsh climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the probation offices maintained their quiet oversight of individuals who were serving alternatives to incarceration. These offices were closed during the overnight hours, but they represented a crucial component of the courthouse's approach to justice that emphasized rehabilitation and community integration rather than simple punishment. Probation. Officer Sandra Williams had developed innovative programs that connected individuals serving probation sentences with community organizations that could provide both support and accountability. Her approach recognized that successful completion of probation required more than just compliance with court orders. It required addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to criminal behavior in the first place. Officer Walsh had observed many of the individuals who participated in these programs, watching them transition from defendants facing uncertain futures to community members who had found stable employment, housing, and social support. The programs required patience and ongoing attention from court personnel, but they produced results that benefited both the individuals involved and the broader community. Robert Johnson was one success story that Officer Walsh remembered clearly. Johnson had been convicted of theft after stealing tools from a construction site where he had previously worked. The theft had occurred during a period when Johnson was struggling with unemployment and alcohol dependency following an injury that had ended his construction career. Rather than serving jail time, Johnson had been sentenced to probation with requirements for substance abuse treatment and community service. Probation Officer Williams had connected him with both addiction counseling services and job training programs that helped him develop new skills compatible with his physical limitations. The program had required Johnson to check in regularly with probation staff, submit to random drug testing, and complete specified hours of community service. But it had also provided him with support services including counseling, job placement assistance, and ongoing monitoring that helped him maintain sobriety and stable employment. Johnson had successfully completed his probation and had become a volunteer mentor for other individuals facing similar challenges. His transformation from defendant to community asset represented the kind of outcome that probation programs were designed to achieve, demonstrating that appropriate support and accountability could help people rebuild their lives after making serious mistakes. Officer Walsh continued his rounds through the administrative offices where court clerks maintained the detailed records that documented every case, every proceeding, and every resolution that passed through the courthouse. These offices were quiet now, but during business hours they hummed with the activity of processing paperwork, scheduling hearings, and maintaining the documentation that ensured legal proceedings were conducted with proper attention to due process and procedural requirements. The records maintained in these offices told the story of the courthouse's work in precise detail, documenting how cases moved through the system and how various types of legal problems were addressed through established procedures. Court clerk Jennifer Martinez had developed systems for tracking cases that ensured nothing fell through administrative cracks and that all parties received proper notification of hearings and deadlines. The filing systems in these offices represented years of careful organization, with cases categorized by type, date, and resolution status. Officer Walsh had observed the meticulous attention that court personnel brought to this documentation, understanding that proper record-keeping was essential for maintaining public confidence in the fairness and consistency of legal proceedings. These records also served as institutional memory, preserving information about how different types of cases had been handled and what approaches had proven most effective in achieving just outcomes. The accumulated wisdom contained in these files provided guidance for handling new cases and helped ensure consistency in how similar situations were addressed over time. Officer Walsh paused at the law library, a quiet space where attorneys, defendants, and sometimes community members conducted research necessary for understanding legal procedures and requirements. The library was equipped with legal texts, reference materials, and computer terminals that provided access to case law and statutes relevant to proceedings in the local courts. The library served an important function in ensuring that all parties had access to the information necessary for effective participation in legal proceedings. Public defender Catherine Thompson regularly brought clients to the library to help them understand the charges they faced and the options available for resolving their cases. Officer Walsh had observed many of these research sessions, watching as defendants learned about their rights and responsibilities while working with their attorneys to develop appropriate strategies for addressing their legal problems. The library provided a quiet space for these crucial conversations, away from the more formal atmosphere of the courtrooms, but still within the courthouse environment that emphasized the seriousness of legal proceedings. The library also served community members who needed to research legal issues related to family matters, property disputes, or other civil concerns. Court personnel had developed programs to help people navigate legal research and understand court procedures, recognizing that access to justice required more than just physical access to the courthouse building. Continuing his rounds, Officer Walsh visited the mediation rooms where many disputes were resolved through facilitated discussion rather than formal trial proceedings. These smaller spaces were designed to encourage dialogue and collaboration, with comfortable seating and neutral decor that helped create an atmosphere conducive to problem solving rather than confrontation. Mediator David Rodriguez had developed expertise in helping parties find common ground and develop mutually acceptable solutions to conflicts that might otherwise require expensive and time-consuming litigation. His approach emphasized understanding rather than winning, helping people recognize shared interests and develop creative solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate needs. Officer Walsh had observed many successful mediation sessions, watching as conflicts that had seemed intractable were resolved through patient dialogue and careful exploration of underlying interests and concerns. Family disputes, neighborhood conflicts, and business disagreements had all been addressed through mediation processes that left relationships intact while resolving specific problems. The success of these mediation programs had reduced the burden on formal court proceedings, while providing community members with more satisfying and lasting solutions to their conflicts. The mediation rooms represented an important innovation in courthouse operations, demonstrating how traditional legal institutions could adapt to serve community needs more effectively. As Officer Walsh completed his rounds through the courthouse, he reflected on the many different ways that justice was served within these walls. The building contained not just courtrooms for formal proceedings, but spaces for education, mediation, counseling, and community service that recognized the complex nature of legal problems and the need for comprehensive solutions. The overnight hours provided opportunity to observe the courthouse in its resting state. When the urgent drama of daily proceedings had settled into the quiet dignity of a building dedicated to serving community needs for justice and conflict resolution. The empty corridors and darkened offices held the accumulated weight of thousands of cases that had been resolved through patient application of legal principles and genuine concern for community welfare. The courthouse represented more than just legal authority. It was a community institution that provided structure and stability for addressing the inevitable conflicts and problems that arose in any society. The building itself, with its solid construction and carefully maintained facilities, projected the permanence and reliability that effective legal institutions required. Officer Walsh took pride in his role as guardian of this institution during the quiet hours when it rested between days of service. His security rounds ensured that the building remained safe and ready for the important work that would resume with the arrival of judges, attorneys, clerks, and community members seeking justice. The courthouse would wake with the dawn, once again filling with the voices and activities of people working together to resolve conflicts and maintain community order. But for now, in the peaceful hours before sunrise, the building rested in dignified silence, its empty halls echoing with the whispered memories of justice quietly served and problems thoughtfully resolved. In the stillness of the pre-dawn courthouse, every case had found its peace. Every conflict had discovered its resolution. Every question of law had been answered through patient application of legal wisdom, accumulated over generations of careful practice. The building held these completed stories within its walls, preserving them as examples and guides for the ongoing work of serving community needs for justice, fairness, and peaceful resolution of human conflicts. The heavy doors, the marble floors, the wooden benches, and the judicial chambers all participated in this quiet dignity, serving as monuments to the patient work of maintaining civil society through institutions that combined legal authority with genuine concern for human welfare. In the silence and shadows of the sleeping courthouse, justice rested peacefully, ready to wake with the dawn and continue its endless work of serving community needs for order, fairness, and peace. The tree-lined streets of Maple Grove stretched through the early morning stillness, like arteries carrying the lifeblood of community connection. Community Relations Officer Elena Vasquez walked these familiar sidewalks with the measured pace of someone who understood that effective police work often happened not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of trust, conversation, and mutual understanding that grew between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. 23 years of walking these same streets had taught Officer Vasquez that every house held stories. Every family navigated challenges that could either strengthen or strain the social fabric that bound the community together. Her role had evolved over the decades from traditional patrol work to something more nuanced, a blend of law enforcement, social work, and community organizing that recognized the complex web of relationships that made neighborhoods either safe or vulnerable. She paused in front of 247 Elm Street, where the Henderson family had lived for 15 years, raising 3 children who had grown from elementary school students to young adults preparing for college. Officer Vasquez remembered responding to calls at this address during various family crises. But more importantly, she remembered the patient work of helping the family develop the resources and communication skills necessary to navigate difficult periods without police intervention. The case that had first brought Officer Vasquez to the Henderson household involved 14-year-old Michael Henderson, who had been caught shoplifting sports equipment from the local athletic store. What could have been processed as simple juvenile theft had revealed itself as symptomatic of larger family struggles that required more comprehensive intervention than traditional law enforcement approaches could provide. Michael's shoplifting had occurred during a period when his father, Robert Henderson, was struggling with unemployment following the closure of the manufacturing plant where he had worked for 12 years. The family's financial stress had created tension in the household, with arguments about money and the future becoming increasingly frequent and destructive to family relationships. Officer Vasquez had recognized that arresting Michael and processing him through the juvenile justice system would likely exacerbate rather than resolve the underlying problems that had led to his poor decision-making. Instead, she had worked with the family to understand the full context of Michael's behavior and to develop a comprehensive approach that addressed both his actions and the family circumstances that had contributed to them. The intervention had required multiple visits to the Henderson household, with Officer Vasquez serving as both authority figure and family counselor as she helped parents and children develop better communication strategies and identify resources for addressing their financial and emotional challenges. She had connected Robert Henderson with job placement services while also working with the family to establish clearer expectations and consequences for Michael's behavior. The resolution had taken months rather than weeks, but it had transformed not just Michael's behavior, but the entire family's approach to handling stress and conflict. Michael had completed community service hours at the same athletic store where he had committed theft, developing a relationship with the owner that eventually led to part-time employment. Robert Henderson had found new work in a different industry, discovering skills and interests that he had never previously explored. Most significantly, the family had learned to communicate about problems before they escalated to crisis levels, developing the kind of mutual support and understanding that would serve them through future challenges. Officer Vasquez had received Christmas cards from the Henderson family for the past 8 years, each one updating her on the children's achievements and expressing gratitude for her patience during their difficult period. Continuing down Elm Street, Officer Vasquez passed 312, where Mrs. Patricia Wong lived alone since her husband's death 3 years earlier. Mrs. Wong's house had been the subject of neighbor concern when mail began accumulating on her front porch, and her usually immaculate garden showed signs of neglect that suggested she might be experiencing health or other problems. Wellness check that Officer Vasquez had conducted had revealed that Mrs. Wong was struggling with depression and social isolation following her husband's death, but was too proud to ask for help from family members who lived in other states. Her withdrawal from community activities and neglect of household maintenance had been symptoms of deeper emotional difficulties that required gentle intervention and ongoing support, rather than treating Mrs. Wong's situation as a law enforcement matter. Officer Vasquez had connected her with social services and community organizations that could provide both practical assistance and emotional support. She had also facilitated conversations between Mrs. Wong and her neighbors, helping them understand how they could provide appropriate assistance without making her feel dependent or burdensome. The solution had involved creating an informal support network among neighbors who took turns checking on Mrs. Wong, including her in social activities, and providing assistance with tasks that had become difficult for her to manage alone. Officer Vasquez had served as coordinator for this network, ensuring that help was provided in ways that preserved Mrs. Wong's dignity and independence while addressing her practical needs. Mrs. Wong had gradually emerged from her isolation, becoming an active participant in neighborhood activities and developing the kind of social connections that provided both emotional support and practical safety nets for managing the challenges of aging. Her transformation from isolated widow to engaged community member had enriched not just her own life, but the entire neighborhood's sense of connection and mutual care. Officer Vasquez turned onto Maple Street, where the Rodriguez family at number 156 had navigated their own complex challenges with patience and community support. The family had immigrated from El Salvador 5 years earlier, and their initial struggles with language barriers, cultural adaptation, and economic establishment had created stresses that occasionally manifested in ways that brought them to police attention. The first incident had involved a noise complaint when the Rodriguez family hosted a traditional celebration that included music and dancing that continued later than their neighbors expected. What could have become a source of ongoing conflict had been transformed into an opportunity for cultural education and community building through Officer Vasquez's patient mediation. Officer Vasquez had organized informal meetings between the Rodriguez family and their neighbors, creating opportunities for people to learn about each other's traditions and expectations while developing mutually acceptable guidelines for community living. The process had required time and patience as different cultural approaches to hospitality, family celebration, and community interaction were discussed and negotiated. The resolution had led to the establishment of what neighbors now called the Maple Street Cultural Exchange, with different families taking turns, hosting events that celebrated their heritage while building understanding and connection across cultural differences. The Rodriguez family had become integral members of the neighborhood community, contributing their skills and traditions while adapting to local customs and expectations. Officer Vasquez reflected on how these kinds of cultural mediation efforts had become increasingly important as the community became more diverse, requiring law enforcement to serve as bridges between different approaches to family life, community celebration, and social interaction. Her work had demonstrated that patient cultural competence could transform potential sources of conflict into opportunities for community enrichment. She continued to Oak Street, where the Morrison family at number 423 had faced challenges related to their teenage son David's struggle with substance abuse. The family's initial contact with police had occurred when David was arrested for possession of marijuana. But Officer Vasquez had recognized that the arrest represented an opportunity for intervention rather than simply punishment. Working with the Morrison family and substance abuse counselors, Officer Vasquez had helped develop a comprehensive treatment plan that addressed both David's drug use and the family dynamics that had contributed to his risky behavior. The approach had required coordination between law enforcement, healthcare providers, school officials, and community organizations to create a support network that could guide David toward healthier choices. The intervention had been successful not because it eliminated David's struggles immediately, but because it provided the family with tools and resources for addressing problems constructively over time. David had completed substance abuse treatment, graduated from high school, and was now attending community college while working part-time and living at home under agreements that balanced independence with accountability. The Morrison family had become advocates for other families dealing with similar challenges, working with Officer Vasquez to develop support groups and educational programs that helped parents understand substance abuse issues and develop effective responses that combined firm boundaries with emotional support. Officer Vasquez paused at the corner of Oak and Pine, where the neighborhood community center had become a focal point for many of the programs and services that had emerged from her years of community relationship building. The center served as neutral ground where neighbors could gather for meetings, celebrations, educational programs, and conflict resolution sessions that prevented many problems from escalating to the level requiring police intervention. The community center had been established through collaborative effort between residents, local government, and community organizations that recognized the need for spaces where neighbors could connect with each other and access resources for addressing various challenges. Officer Vasquez had played a crucial role in identifying needs and coordinating services, but the center's success depended on resident participation and ownership. The programs offered at the center included parenting classes, English as a second language instruction, financial literacy workshops, and support groups for various challenges including grief, addiction, and domestic violence. These programs addressed many of the underlying issues that could contribute to criminal behavior, providing preventive intervention that strengthened community resilience. Officer Vasquez had observed how the community center had become more than just a service provider. It had become a symbol of the neighborhood's commitment to mutual support and collective problem solving. Residents who had initially been strangers had developed relationships through center activities, creating informal networks of communication and assistance that enhanced both safety and quality of life. Walking down Pine Street, Officer Vasquez passed 789, where the Chun family had dealt with the challenges of caring for elderly parents while raising young children in a multi-generational household that sometimes felt overcrowded and stressful. The family had come to police attention when arguments between generations had become loud enough to prompt neighbor concern about potential domestic violence. The situation had required sensitive handling that respected both the family's cultural values and their genuine need for support in managing complex household dynamics. Officer Vasquez had worked with social services to identify resources for elderly care, while also helping the family develop better communication strategies for resolving conflicts constructively. The intervention had included connecting the family with cultural liaisons who understood both traditional approaches to elder care and modern resources for supporting multi-generational families. The solution had involved modifications to the household living arrangements, along with regular family meetings facilitated by counselors who understood the cultural context of their situation. The Chun family had successfully maintained their multi-generational living arrangement while developing the tools and support systems necessary for managing stress and conflict in healthy ways. Their experience had informed the development of programs for other immigrant families facing similar challenges, contributing to the community center's growing capacity for culturally sensitive family support services. Officer Vasquez reflected on how these individual family interventions had contributed to broader community understanding and capacity for addressing the complex challenges that arose when different generations, cultures, and economic circumstances intersected within the same neighborhood. Each successful intervention provided lessons that could guide future responses to similar situations. She continued to the intersection of Pine and Cedar, where the Williams family at 234 Cedar had navigated the challenges of divorce and single parenthood with community support that had prevented family stress from becoming community problems. Officer Vasquez had first met Sarah Williams when she called police during the custody dispute that had escalated beyond normal disagreement to include threats and property damage. The initial response to the domestic disturbance had revealed a family in crisis, with two parents struggling to maintain civility for the sake of their children, while dealing with their own anger and disappointment about their failed marriage. Officer Vasquez had recognized that traditional law enforcement approaches would likely exacerbate rather than resolve the underlying tensions. Instead of simply enforcing restraining orders or making arrests, Officer Vasquez had worked with family mediators and child welfare specialists to help both parents understand how their conflict was affecting their children and to develop more constructive approaches to managing their disagreements. The process had required multiple interventions and ongoing supervision as the family learned new patterns of communication and conflict resolution. The resolution had taken nearly 2 years, but it had resulted in a co-parenting arrangement that prioritized the children's needs while allowing both parents to maintain meaningful relationships with their children. Sarah Williams had become a volunteer mediator herself, helping other divorcing families develop the skills necessary for maintaining family stability despite parental separation. The Williams case had demonstrated how family conflicts could be transformed into opportunities for personal growth and community service through patient intervention and appropriate support services. Officer Vasquez had maintained periodic contact with the family over the years, watching the children grow into healthy, well-adjusted teenagers despite their parents' divorce. As Officer Vasquez completed her morning walk through the neighborhood, she reflected on the dozens of families whose stories had become interwoven with her own through years of patient community relationship building. Each case had required different approaches and resources, but all had been resolved through sustained attention to the underlying causes of problems rather than simply their immediate symptoms. The neighborhood she patrolled had been transformed not through dramatic interventions, but through the quiet accumulation of trust, understanding, and mutual support that grew when law enforcement approached community problems as opportunities for education and relationship building rather than simply enforcement actions. The houses along these familiar streets now represented more than just addresses where she had responded to calls. They were homes where she had helped families develop the tools and resources necessary for navigating life's challenges while contributing to rather than detracting from community safety and stability. Officer Vasquez understood that this approach to police work required different skills and different measures of success than traditional law enforcement. Her effectiveness was measured not in arrests made or citations issued, but in the number of families who had learned to resolve conflicts without police intervention, the frequency of repeat calls that had decreased over time, and the general sense of community cohesion that had developed through patient relationship building. The early morning stillness that surrounded her as she walked these streets was not the silence of isolation or fear, but the peaceful quiet of a Conda's community that had learned to take care of itself through networks of mutual support and understanding. The work would continue as new families moved into the neighborhood and existing families faced new challenges. But the foundation of trust and communication that had been built over years of patient effort would provide the structure for addressing whatever problems might arise. In the amber glow of streetlights that would soon be replaced by morning sun, Officer Vasquez carried the satisfaction of work well done and relationships carefully built, knowing that the invisible threads of community connection that she had helped weave would continue to provide strength and support for neighbors who had learned to see each other not as strangers, but as fellow travelers on the complex journey of building and maintaining a place where families could grow and thrive in safety and peace. Central Police Station settled into its nighttime rhythm as the last of the day shift completed their reports and handed over responsibility to the officers who would guard the community's safety through the quiet hours until dawn. Sergeant Michael Torres had worked the night shift for 8 years, long enough to understand that the period between midnight and sunrise offered opportunities for reflection, thorough documentation, and the kind of careful follow-up work that often made the difference between temporary fixes and lasting solutions. At the main desk area of the station maintained a peaceful efficiency during these overnight hours, with dispatchers handling the occasional call while officers completed paperwork that would document the day's activities and prepare for the investigations and community contacts that tomorrow would bring. The atmosphere was one of contemplative productivity, where important work continued at a pace that allowed for thoughtful attention to detail. Sergeant Torres reviewed the incident reports that had accumulated throughout the day, each one representing not just immediate law enforcement response but potential opportunities for the kind of follow-up work that could prevent future problems. His approach to night shift supervision emphasized using the quieter hours for analysis, planning, and the careful documentation that would guide ongoing community policing efforts. The first report dealt with a vandalism incident at Jefferson High School, where someone had spray-painted messages on the gymnasium wall during the weekend. Officer Patricia Kim had responded to the initial call and conducted a thorough investigation that went beyond simply documenting the property damage to understand the context and motivation behind the graffiti. The messages painted on the gymnasium wall were not random acts of destruction, but coherent statements expressing student frustration with recent budget cuts that had eliminated several popular programs, including art classes and after-school activities. Officer Kim had recognized that the vandalism represented an attempt at communication rather than simple property destruction, suggesting that the underlying concerns might be addressed through dialogue rather than purely punitive measures. Officer Kim had worked with school administrators to organize student forums where concerns about budget cuts could be expressed through appropriate channels. The forums had revealed widespread student disappointment about the elimination of creative programs and had led to collaborative efforts to identify alternative funding sources and volunteer support that could restore some of the canceled activities. The vandalism case had been resolved not through criminal prosecution, but through community engagement that transformed student frustration into constructive advocacy for educational programs. The student responsible for the graffiti had eventually identified himself and had become a leader in student government efforts to support arts education and extracurricular activities. Sergeant Torres made notes about scheduling follow-up visits to the school to monitor the ongoing success of the student engagement programs and to maintain the positive relationship between police and school administration that had made this constructive resolution possible. The case exemplified how night shift planning could identify opportunities for community building that extended far beyond immediate law enforcement responses. The next report documented a domestic disturbance call that had required careful mediation to prevent escalation to violence. Officer David Rodriguez had responded to complaints about loud arguing at the Martinez household, where economic stress was creating tension between family members who were struggling to maintain stability during a difficult period. The argument that had prompted the police call centered around 18-year-old Carlos Martinez's decision to leave college and find employment to help support his family after his father's injury had left him unable to work. Carlos's parents wanted him to continue his education, but the family's financial situation made this choice increasingly difficult to sustain. Officer Rodriguez had spent considerable time with the Martinez family, helping them understand each other's perspectives and explore options that might address both their immediate financial needs and their long-term goals for Carlos's future. The mediation had required multiple visits and consultation with social service agencies that could provide information about financial assistance and educational support programs. The resolution had involved connecting the family with vocational rehabilitation services that could help Carlos's father develop new skills compatible with his physical limitations, while also identifying scholarship programs and part-time work opportunities that could allow Carlos to continue his education while contributing to family income. Sergeant Torres noted that the Martinez case required ongoing monitoring to ensure that the family successfully accessed the support services they needed, and that the agreements reached during mediation continued to work for all family members. The case demonstrated how domestic disturbances often reflected larger social and economic problems that required comprehensive intervention rather than simple conflict resolution. Turning to the next report, Sergeant Torres reviewed documentation of a theft investigation that had revealed community vulnerabilities requiring systematic attention. Detective Jennifer Thompson had investigated a series of bicycle thefts from apartment complexes throughout the downtown area, discovering patterns that suggested coordinated criminal activity rather than random opportunistic crime. The investigation had revealed that the thefts were targeting specific types of bicycles and occurring during predictable time periods when apartment complexes were least likely to have residents monitoring parking and storage areas. The thieves demonstrated familiarity with apartment complex layouts and security procedures, suggesting possible inside knowledge or systematic surveillance of potential targets. Detective Thompson had worked with apartment complex managers to improve security procedures and had organized resident education programs about bicycle storage and theft prevention. The investigation had also identified weaknesses in lighting and surveillance that made certain areas particularly vulnerable to criminal activity. The theft ring had been dismantled through coordinated surveillance and community cooperation. But the investigation had revealed broader issues about downtown housing security that required ongoing attention. Sergeant Torres scheduled follow-up meetings with apartment managers and resident organizations to monitor the effectiveness of improved security measures and to maintain communication networks that could prevent future criminal activity. Next case file dealt with a missing person report that had required extensive coordination between multiple agencies to locate a teenager who had run away from home during a family crisis. 16-year-old Ashley Wong had disappeared after an argument with her parents about academic expectations and future plans, leaving no indication of where she might have gone or whether she was in danger. Officer Sandra Chun had coordinated the search effort, working with school officials, social service agencies, and youth organizations to understand Ashley's social connections and identify places where she might seek shelter or assistance. The investigation had required sensitivity to family dynamics while maintaining focus on Ashley's safety and well-being. The search had expanded to include neighboring jurisdictions and social media outreach designed to encourage Ashley to make contact with authorities or family members. Officer Chun had also worked with the Wong family to understand the conflicts that had prompted Ashley's departure and to develop approaches that might encourage her to return home voluntarily. Ashley had been located after 5 days, staying with friends who had provided temporary shelter, while she processed her feelings about family expectations and her own goals for the future. Officer Chun had facilitated family counseling sessions that helped both Ashley and her parents understand each other's perspectives and develop more effective communication strategies. The resolution of the case had required ongoing support from family counseling services and youth advocacy organizations that could help the Wong family maintain improved relationships while addressing the academic and social pressures that had contributed to the original conflict. Sergeant Torres noted the need for continued monitoring to ensure that the family successfully implemented the POVAM communication strategies they had learned during crisis intervention. Moving through the stack of reports, Sergeant Torres reviewed documentation of a noise complaint investigation that had evolved into a comprehensive community mediation effort. The Riverside apartment complex had been experiencing ongoing conflicts between residents with different work schedules, cultural backgrounds, and approaches to community living that were creating stress for everyone in the building. Officer Maria Santos had responded to multiple noise complaints over several weeks before recognizing that individual enforcement actions were not addressing the underlying communication problems that were creating recurring conflicts between neighbors. She had worked with apartment management and resident representatives to organize community meetings focused on developing mutually acceptable guidelines for shared living. The mediation process had required multiple sessions and careful attention to cultural differences in approaches to hospitality, family gathering, and community interaction. Officer Santos had served as both facilitator and educator, helping residents understand each other's perspectives while developing practical solutions to specific conflicts. The resolution had involved establishing quiet hours that balanced the needs of residents with different work schedules, creating shared spaces for community gatherings that reduced pressure on individual apartments, and developing communication procedures that encouraged direct neighbor-to-neighbor problem solving before conflicts escalated to the level requiring police intervention. Sergeant Torres scheduled regular follow-up visits to the Riverside complex to monitor the ongoing success of the community mediation programs and to provide support for maintaining the improved neighbor relationships that had been developed through the intervention process. The night shift environment provided ideal conditions for this kind of analytical review and follow-up planning. The reduced pace of emergency responses allowed for thoughtful consideration of how individual cases connected to broader community patterns and how successful interventions might be replicated in other situations. Sergeant Torres turned his attention to a report documenting investigation of suspicious activity in Riverside Park, where residents had reported seeing individuals conducting what appeared to be drug transactions during evening hours. Officer Robert Martinez had conducted extensive surveillance before determining that the activity was actually an informal food-sharing network organized by community members to support neighbors experiencing food insecurity. Rather than disrupting this community support effort, Officer Martinez had worked with park administrators and social service agencies to formalize the program in ways that addressed safety concerns while maintaining its accessibility to people in need. The resolution had involved establishing designated times and areas for food distribution, along with improved lighting and security, measures that benefited all park users. The case had demonstrated how careful investigation could reveal positive community activity that might be mistaken for criminal behavior, and how law enforcement could support rather than interfere with grassroots efforts to address social problems. Sergeant Torres noted the need for ongoing coordination with social service agencies to ensure that the food sharing program continued to meet community needs while maintaining appropriate safety and security standards. The desk area remained quiet except for the soft clicking of keyboards as officers completed their documentation and the occasional radio communication from patrol units, conducting routine security checks throughout the community. The peaceful atmosphere of the night shift allowed for the kind of reflective work that was essential for effective community policing but often difficult to accomplish during busier daylight hours. Sergeant Torres reviewed a report about a shoplifting incident that had been resolved through educational intervention rather than criminal prosecution. 17-year-old Marcus Johnson had been caught stealing clothing from a department store, but investigation had revealed that the theft was motivated by embarrassment about his family's financial situation rather than any criminal intent or disregard for others' property. Officer Janet Kim had worked with store management, Marcus's family, and school counselors to develop a response that addressed both the immediate violation and the underlying social pressures that had contributed to his poor decision-making. Marcus had completed community service hours at the same store where he had committed the theft, developing an understanding of how his actions affected both the business and other customers. The intervention had also connected Marcus's family with financial assistance programs and had provided Marcus with access to clothing banks and other resources that could address his immediate needs without requiring theft. The case had been resolved without criminal charges, but with clear consequences and education that helped Marcus understand better options for addressing future challenges. Sergeant Torres made notes about following up with Marcus and his family to ensure that they had successfully connected with the support services identified during the intervention and that Marcus was maintaining the positive behavioral changes he had committed to making. The station's holding cells remained empty during the quiet overnight hours, a reminder that effective police work often involved preventing problems rather than simply responding to them after they had escalated to the level requiring arrest and detention. The night shift provided opportunities for the kind of preventive work that could reduce the need for these more dramatic interventions. As Sergeant Torres continued his review of the day's cases, he reflected on how the documentation and follow-up planning that characterized night shift work contributed to the overall effectiveness of community policing efforts. Each case represented not just an immediate problem that had been resolved, but a learning opportunity that could inform future responses to similar situations. The quiet hours also provided time for communication with other agencies and community organizations that played crucial roles in addressing the underlying social and economic problems that often contributed to criminal behavior. Sergeant Torres maintained contact with social service providers, school officials, and community leaders who could provide resources and support that complemented law enforcement efforts. The night shift approach to police work emphasized patience, thoroughness, and collaborative problem-solving rather than rapid response and immediate resolution. This approach required different skills and different measures of success than traditional law enforcement, but it produced results that strengthened community relationships and addressed problems in ways that prevented their recurrence. As the clock approached the deepest hours of the night, Sergeant Torres completed his review of the day's reports and began preparing the briefing materials that would guide the day shift's follow-up activities. The work of the night shift would continue seamlessly into the activities of the next day, with each shift building on the careful documentation and analysis that had been completed during the quiet hours. The station settled deeper into its nighttime rhythm, maintaining its vigilant watch over community safety while providing the stable foundation for the patient work of building and maintaining the relationships that made effective community policing possible. In the gentle glow of desk lamps and the soft sound of keyboards, the night shift continued its essential work of transformation, healing, and preparation for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The steady rhythm of the station clock marked time not in urgent moments, but in the patient accumulation of trust, understanding, and community connection that grew through consistent attention to the small details that made the difference between temporary fixes and lasting solutions. In this peaceful environment, every hour brought quiet resolution to problems that daylight made seem insurmountable, demonstrating that the most important police work often happened in the gentle persistence of those who understood that healing takes time. Evidence custodian Margaret Flynn unlocked the climate-controlled storage facility that housed the department's collection of case materials, each item carefully cataloged and preserved according to protocols that ensured both legal integrity and historical preservation. After 26 years of managing these archives, she had developed an almost reverent appreciation for the stories contained within these organized rows of boxes, files, and secured storage units. The fluorescent lighting cast a steady glow over metal shelving that stretched from floor to ceiling, creating corridors lined with cases that had been resolved and closed, their urgency transformed into the quiet dignity of completed justice. Each box bore labels indicating case numbers, dates, and brief descriptions that captured in a few words the human dramas that had once commanded the full attention of investigators, attorneys, and families seeking answers. Margaret paused at a section containing materials from the 1980s, where cases that had once captured community attention now rested in peaceful resolution. The photographs and documents stored here represented not just evidence of crimes, but testimony to the patient work of law enforcement, the careful process of justice, and the healing that came when communities worked together to address problems and support those affected by criminal activity. She selected a box marked Case 1984847, Morrison Art. Theft closed, removing it carefully from its designated shelf space. The case had involved the theft of several paintings from the home of elderly art collector Eleanor Morrison, a crime that had initially seemed like simple burglary but had evolved into a complex investigation that revealed both the vulnerability of isolated seniors and the importance of community vigilance in protecting those who might be targeted by criminals seeking easy victims. The investigation files contained photographs of Mrs. Morrison's home, showing rooms filled with carefully collected artwork that represented decades of passionate acquisition and curation. The stolen pieces had included not just valuable paintings but personal treasures that connected Mrs. Morrison to her late husband's memory and to artists whose work had brought joy to their shared life. Detective Robert Anderson had approached the case with characteristic thoroughness, recognizing that the theft represented more than simple property crime. The photographs documented his careful examination of the crime scene, showing how the thieves had selected specific pieces while leaving others undisturbed, suggesting knowledge of art values and markets that indicated this was not random burglary. The investigation had expanded to include art dealers, auction houses, and collectors throughout the region as Detective Anderson worked to understand how stolen artwork might be sold and to identify individuals who might have both the knowledge and connections necessary to dispose of valuable paintings. The photograph showed meetings with art experts who provided education about authentication, provenance, and the specialized world of art commerce. That Margaret found photographs documenting the breakthrough in the case. when one of the stolen paintings appeared at an auction house in a neighboring city. The detailed images showed Detective Anderson working with auction house staff to trace the painting's recent history, leading to identification of the intermediary who had consigned it for sale without proper documentation of ownership. The investigation had revealed a network of individuals who specialized in targeting elderly collectors, using social connections and community knowledge to identify potential victims who lived alone with valuable collections. The photographs documented the arrests of 3 individuals who had been systematically identifying and victimizing isolated seniors throughout the region. The resolution. Photographs showed Mrs. Morrison's joy at the recovery of her stolen artwork, but more importantly, they captured the community response that had grown from the investigation. Neighbors had organized informal security networks to check on elderly residents, and local art organizations had developed programs to help collectors document and protect their collections while maintaining the social connections that provided both security and companionship. Margaret returned the Morrison file to its proper place and selected another box from the same era, this one containing materials from a missing person case that had required extensive community mobilization before reaching its peaceful resolution. The case had involved 8-year-old Timothy Chun, who had disappeared during a neighborhood festival, triggering one of the largest search efforts in department history. The photographs documented the systematic search that had covered expanding areas around the festival site, with images showing hundreds of volunteers working alongside law enforcement to examine every possible location where a lost child might be found. The careful organization of this search effort was evident in aerial photographs that showed the grid pattern used to ensure comprehensive coverage of the area. Detective Linda Kim had coordinated the search while also conducting interviews with festival attendees, family members, and anyone who might have information about Timothy's movements before his disappearance. The investigation photographs showed the careful documentation of witness statements and the timeline reconstruction that helped investigators understand the sequence of events leading to Timothy's disappearance. The breakthrough had come when searchers found Timothy in an abandoned building, several blocks from the festival site, where he had become trapped while exploring what he thought was an interesting hiding place. The photographs captured the moment of his rescue, showing the relief of family members and the satisfaction of search volunteers who had dedicated days to finding him safely. More significantly, the case photographs documented the community changes that had resulted from Timothy's disappearance and recovery. Images showed the installation of better lighting and security measures at festival sites, the development of child identification programs that would help in future emergencies, and the establishment of neighborhood watch networks that increased overall community safety. Margaret selected materials from a domestic violence case that had been resolved through patient intervention and comprehensive support services rather than simple arrest and prosecution. The case had involved Maria Santos and her children, who had been living in fear of her abusive partner before finding the courage and resources necessary to establish safety and independence. The evidence photographs showed the progression from initial police response to a domestic disturbance call through the careful documentation of injuries, threats, and property damage that had characterized the abusive relationship. Officer Patricia Wong had responded to multiple calls at the Santos household, gradually building trust with Maria and helping her understand the resources and legal protections available to domestic violence victims. The investigation materials included photographs of the shelter facility where Maria and her children had found temporary safety while working with advocates to develop a long-term plan for independence. The images showed not just physical security measures, but the supportive environment that helped domestic violence survivors rebuild their confidence and develop the skills necessary for independent living, the resolution. Photographs captured Maria's graduation from a job training program and the family's move to permanent housing in a different neighborhood where they could start fresh without fear of continued harassment. The case materials also documented the prosecution of the abusive partner and his enrollment in counseling programs designed to address the underlying issues that had contributed to his violent behavior. Margaret found the domestic violence cases particularly moving because they documented not just the resolution of immediate crises but the long-term process of healing and rebuilding that allowed families to move from fear to safety, from crisis to stability. The photographs captured both the pain of victimization and the hope that came with effective intervention and support. She turned to materials from a fraud investigation that had revealed the vulnerability of elderly community members to sophisticated scams designed to exploit their trusting nature and social isolation. The case had begun with reports from several seniors who had been contacted by individuals claiming to represent various charitable organizations, government agencies, and financial institutions, seeking personal information or requesting immediate payments for supposed emergencies. Detective Michael Rodriguez had investigated what initially appeared to be isolated incidents, but gradually revealed itself as part of an organized effort targeting elderly residents throughout the community. The evidence photographs showed the sophisticated materials that fraudsters had used to make their schemes appear legitimate, including official-looking documents, uniforms, and identification that could deceive even careful potential victims. Investigation had required collaboration with federal authorities and telecommunications companies to trace calls and identify the individuals responsible for the fraud network. Photographs documented the complex financial transactions that fraudsters had used to hide their activities and launder money stolen from their victims. Case had been resolved through arrests of multiple individuals and recovery of substantial amounts of money that were returned to victims. But the investigation had also revealed the need for better education and protection for elderly community members who might be targeted by similar schemes. The evidence materials included photographs of community education sessions where Detective Rodriguez worked with senior citizen organizations to provide information about recognizing and avoiding fraud attempts. Margaret selected materials from a case involving juvenile crime that had been addressed through innovative intervention programs rather than traditional prosecution. The case had involved 16-year-old Marcus Williams, who had been caught vandalizing school property during a period when he was struggling with family problems and academic difficulties that had left him feeling frustrated and disconnected from his community. The investigation photographs showed the extent of the vandalism, but they also captured Officer Janet Thompson's careful attention to understanding the circumstances that had led to Marcus's destructive behavior. Rather than simply processing him through the juvenile justice system, Officer Thompson had worked with school officials, family members, and community organizations to develop a comprehensive response that addressed both accountability and the underlying problems that had contributed to his poor choices. The evidence materials documented Marcus's participation in community service projects that allowed him to make direct amends for the property damage while also developing positive relationships with adult mentors and community leaders. Photographs showed his work on various improvement projects at the school and in the neighborhood, demonstrating how destructive impulses could be redirected toward constructive community contribution. The resolution photographs captured Marcus's graduation from high school and his acceptance into a technical training program that provided clear direction for his future career development. The case materials also documented his continued involvement in community service activities and his work as a mentor for other young people facing similar challenges. Moving through the evidence storage area, Margaret reflected on how these preserved materials told stories, not just of crimes committed and solved, but of communities working together to address problems, support victims, and prevent future incidents. The photographs and documents represented more than legal evidence. They were historical records of how neighborhoods, families, and institutions had responded to challenges with patience, creativity, and genuine concern for human welfare. She selected materials from a FAO property theft case that had revealed community vulnerabilities while also demonstrating the effectiveness of neighborhood cooperation in both solving crimes and preventing their recurrence. The case had involved a series of break-ins at local businesses during weekend hours when commercial areas were typically unmonitored and unoccupied. Detective Sandra Martinez had investigated the break-ins as part of a coordinated pattern rather than isolated incidents, using surveillance photographs and witness statements to understand how criminals were identifying and accessing vulnerable properties. The evidence materials showed the systematic approach that thieves had used to study business locations, security procedures, and occupancy patterns that created opportunities for undisturbed criminal activity. The investigation had been successful, not only in identifying and arresting the individuals responsible for the break-ins, but also in working with business owners and community organizations to improve security measures and establish informal surveillance networks that could detect suspicious activity before crimes occurred. The resolution photographs showed improved lighting, security cameras, and communication systems that had been installed in the commercial district following the investigation. More importantly, they captured community meetings where business owners, residents, and law enforcement had worked together to develop ongoing strategies for maintaining the safety and security that supported economic vitality and community pride. Margaret paused at materials from a missing person case that had required extensive investigation and community cooperation before reaching its resolution. The case had involved Eleanor Hoffman, a 73-year-old woman who had disappeared from her apartment without explanation, leaving no indication of where she might have gone or whether she was in danger. Detective William Chun had approached the investigation with methodical persistence, conducting extensive interviews with neighbors, family members, and acquaintances while organizing searches of areas where Mrs. Hoffman might have traveled or sought shelter. The evidence photographs documented both the systematic investigation and the community mobilization that had supported the search effort. The breakthrough had come when Mrs. Hoffman was located in a hospital in a distant city, where she had been receiving treatment for a medical emergency that had left her temporarily confused and unable to provide information about her identity or address. The photographs captured her reunion with family members and her safe return to the community that had been concerned for her welfare. The case materials also documented the changes that had resulted from Mrs. Hoffman's disappearance, including better communication systems for monitoring the welfare of elderly residents living alone, and improved coordination between healthcare facilities and law enforcement agencies for identifying and assisting individuals who might become separated from their support systems during medical emergencies. As Margaret continued her review of the archived evidence, she was struck by the consistent themes that emerged from cases spanning different time periods and different types of criminal activity. Effective law enforcement seemed to require patience, community cooperation, and attention to underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms of social problems. The photographs and documents preserved in these archives told stories of transformation rather than just punishment, of communities working together to address problems rather than simply responding to their effects. Each case had required different approaches and different resources, but all had been resolved through sustained attention to human welfare and genuine concern for community safety and stability. The evidence storage facility represented more than just legal requirement for maintaining case materials. It was a repository of community memory, preserving lessons learned through experience and wisdom, gained through patient application of both legal authority and human understanding. The archived materials would continue to inform future investigations and community interventions, providing examples and guidance for addressing similar challenges as they arose. Margaret carefully returned the case materials to their designated storage locations, ensuring that each box was properly positioned and labeled for future access. The climate-controlled environment would preserve these materials indefinitely, maintaining their integrity as both legal records and historical documents that captured important moments in the ongoing work of maintaining justice and community safety. The quiet of the evidence facility provided ideal conditions for reflection on the accumulated wisdom contained in these archived cases. Each investigation had contributed to the department's understanding of effective approaches to different types of problems, building institutional knowledge that would guide future officers facing similar challenges. In the steady fluorescent lighting and organized silence of the evidence storage area, these completed cases rested peacefully, their stories preserved as testimony to the patient work of law enforcement, the resilience of communities facing challenges, and the healing that came when justice was pursued with both firmness and compassion. The evidence room held more than objects. It cradled fragments of time itself, each photograph a window into moments when lives had changed course and found their way back to peace. Each document a record of problems solved and communities strengthened through the careful application of law, patience, and genuine human concern for the welfare of all community members. Detective Captain Sarah Chun stood at her office window on the 4th floor of the police headquarters, watching the city settle into the peaceful rhythm of a Tuesday evening in late autumn. After 31 years of service, she had developed the habit of using these quiet moments to reflect on how the community had changed, how the streets below held layers of memory from cases that had once seemed urgent, but now existed only as lessons learned and wisdom, gained through patient application of community-focused law enforcement. The intersection visible from her window had been the site of numerous incidents over the decades, but each location now carried the peaceful weight of problems resolved rather than the tension of ongoing crisis. The corner of 5th and Main, where the old hardware store still operated under the same family ownership, had once been a gathering place for youth whose lack of structured activities had sometimes led to conflicts that required police intervention. Captain Chen remembered the case from 15 years earlier, when a group of teenagers had been regularly congregating in the store's parking lot during evening hours, creating noise and occasional disturbances that prompted complaints from neighboring businesses. Rather than simply dispersing the group or making arrests for loitering, Officer Michael Rodriguez had taken time to understand why the teenagers were drawn to that particular location and what needs their gathering might represent. The investigation had revealed that the teenagers were primarily from families where parents worked evening shifts, leaving them unsupervised during hours when they were too old for traditional after-school programs, but still needed structure and adult guidance. The hardware store parking lot had become their default meeting place, not because they intended to cause problems, but because it offered the social connection they were seeking during otherwise lonely evening hours. Officer Rodriguez had worked with community organizations and the store owner to develop an informal youth program that provided structured activities and adult mentorship during the problematic evening hours. The parking lot gatherings had been transformed from a source of community tension into an opportunity for positive youth development and community building. The program had eventually grown into a formal community center that served not just the original group of teenagers, but families throughout the neighborhood who needed support, resources, and social connection. Captain Chun could see the community center building from her window, its lights glowing warmly in the evening. Darkness as it continued to serve the needs that had originally manifested as simple loitering complaints, turning her attention to the residential area visible to the north. Captain Chun reflected on Maple Grove Avenue, where the Morrison family had once struggled with challenges that had brought them to police attention multiple times before finding the support and resources necessary for stability and growth. The tree-lined street now represented one of the most cohesive neighborhoods in the city, with residents who had learned to address problems collaboratively before they escalated to crisis levels that the Morrison case had begun with domestic disturbance calls related to arguments between parents and their adult son who had moved back home after losing his job. The conflicts had been loud enough to disturb neighbors and had seemed to be escalating toward potential violence before Officer Patricia Wong had intervened with a patient approach that addressed underlying family dynamics rather than simply responding to immediate symptoms. Officer Wong had worked with the family over several months, helping them develop communication strategies and access resources for addressing the economic pressures that were creating stress in their household. The intervention had required coordination with employment services, family counseling programs, and financial assistance agencies that could address the multiple challenges the family was facing. Asterisk. The resolution had transformed not just the Morrison family situation, but the entire neighborhood's approach to addressing conflicts and supporting families during difficult periods. Neighbors had developed informal networks for sharing resources, providing emotional support, and identifying problems before they required police intervention. Captain Chun had received Christmas cards from the Morrison family for the past 8 years, each one updating her on family members' achievements and expressing gratitude for the patience and understanding they had received during their crisis period. Their adult son had found stable employment, completed technical training, and was now married with children of his own who played safely in the same neighborhood where their father had once struggled with feelings of failure and frustration. The view from her office also encompassed the downtown business district, where several cases had resulted in improved security measures and stronger relationships between law enforcement and local merchants. The area had once experienced recurring problems with break-ins and vandalism, but collaborative approaches to crime prevention had created a secure and thriving commercial environment. Captain Chun remembered the investigation that had revealed how a group of young people had been systematically targeting businesses during weekend hours when commercial areas were typically unmonitored. Detective Linda Martinez had approached the case by analyzing patterns of criminal activity while also working to understand the social and economic circumstances that had led to the criminal behavior. The investigation had identified 3 individuals who had turned to crime after losing employment when a local manufacturing plant closed, eliminating hundreds of jobs that had provided economic stability for working-class families throughout the community. Rather than simply prosecuting the crimes, Detective Martinez had worked with employment agencies, social services, and community organizations to address the underlying economic distress that had contributed to the criminal activity. The resolution had involved not just holding individuals accountable for their crimes, but connecting them with job training programs, financial counseling, and other services that could provide legitimate alternatives to criminal activity. The business district had also implemented improved security measures and developed communication networks that allowed merchants to support each other and coordinate with law enforcement for ongoing safety. The commercial area now thrived with small businesses, community events, and a sense of shared ownership and responsibility that had grown from the collaborative approach to addressing security concerns. The evening lights visible from Captain Chun's window represented not just commercial activity, but community vitality that had been strengthened through patient work to address problems comprehensively rather than simply suppressing their symptoms. Looking toward the eastern part of the city, Captain Chun could see the roof of Jefferson High School, where innovative approaches to addressing student conflicts had created a model for other educational institutions facing similar challenges. The school had once experienced recurring problems with vandalism, fights, and other disciplinary issues that had required frequent police intervention and had created tension between law enforcement and the educational community. Transformation had begun when Officer Janet Kim had been assigned as the school's community liaison, working directly with students, teachers, and administrators to understand the underlying causes of disciplinary problems and to develop preventive approaches that address student needs rather than simply punishing violations. Officer Kim had discovered that many of the problems stemmed from insufficient opportunities for student leadership, creative expression, and constructive engagement with school governance. Working with educators and parent organizations, she had helped develop programs that channeled student energy into positive activities, while also creating mechanisms for addressing grievances and conflicts through dialogue rather than disruption. The school had become a model for community-based approaches to educational discipline, with student mediation programs, restorative justice practices, and collaborative problem-solving that had dramatically reduced the need for police intervention while improving overall school climate and academic achievement. Other schools throughout the region had adopted similar programs based on the successful innovations developed at Jefferson High. Captain Chun reflected on how these individual cases had contributed to broader changes in how law enforcement approached community problems, moving from reactive responses to proactive relationship building and collaborative problem solving. The view from her window encompassed a city that had learned to address challenges before they became crises, to support community members during difficult periods, and to transform problems into opportunities for strengthening social connections and mutual support. The residential neighborhoods visible in the distance had developed informal support networks that provided assistance to elderly residents, newcomers to the community, and families facing economic or social challenges. These networks had grown from police initiatives that had recognized the importance of community capacity building for preventing crime and maintaining social stability. Captain Chen remembered the community policing programs that had been established in response to demographic changes that had brought new immigrants to the city, creating both opportunities for cultural enrichment and challenges related to communication, cultural understanding, and social integration. Rather than allowing these challenges to create division or conflict, law enforcement had worked with community organizations to facilitate dialogue and mutual education. Officer David Santos had developed programs that brought together longtime residents and newcomers for cultural exchange events, language learning opportunities, and collaborative community improvement projects. These programs had prevented the kind of cultural tensions that could lead to discrimination, conflict, and criminal activity while creating stronger, more diverse neighborhoods that benefited from the contributions of all residents. The success of these integration programs had made the city a model for other communities facing similar demographic transitions, demonstrating how patient cultural competence and community engagement could transform potential sources of conflict into assets for community development. From her office window, Captain Chun could also see the park where evening joggers followed paths that had once been sites of concern about safety and criminal activity. The transformation of the park from a place that many residents avoided after dark to a popular location for family activities and community gatherings represented years of patient work to address both safety concerns and underlying social problems. Detective Robert Wong had investigated reports of drug activity in the park, discovering that what appeared to be criminal behavior was actually an informal network of community members sharing resources and support with neighbors experiencing homelessness and food insecurity. Rather than disrupting this community support effort, Detective Wong had worked with social service agencies and park administrators to formalize and expand the assistance programs while addressing legitimate safety and security concerns. Park now hosted regular community events, including farmers markets, outdoor concerts, and cultural celebrations that had grown from the collaborative relationships developed through the original investigation. The evening activities visible from Captain Chun's window represented a thriving community space that served residents of all ages and backgrounds, providing opportunities for recreation, social connection, and cultural exchange. The transformation of the park had required ongoing coordination between law enforcement, park management, social service agencies, and community organizations, demonstrating how effective community policing required sustained partnership rather than temporary interventions. The success had influenced similar improvements in other public spaces throughout the city. Captain Chun turned her attention to the western neighborhoods, where the Chun family had once struggled with the challenges of caring for elderly parents while raising young children in a multi-generational household that sometimes experienced conflicts requiring police mediation. The area now represented some of the most stable and supportive residential communities in the city, with strong intergenerational relationships and cultural preservation that enriched the broader community. Officer Maria Rodriguez had worked with the Chun family and similar households to develop culturally appropriate approaches to family mediation that respected traditional values while addressing modern challenges related to economic pressures, cultural adaptation, and intergenerational communication. The interventions had required understanding of cultural dynamics and family structures that differed from mainstream American patterns. The success with individual families had led to broader programs that supported immigrant families while also educating the wider community about cultural diversity and the contributions that different traditions could make to community life. The neighborhoods now hosted cultural centers, language preservation programs, and intergenerational activities that had strengthened both cultural identity and community integration. These cultural programs had become resources for the entire city, providing educational opportunities, cultural events, and models for respectful cross-cultural interaction that had enriched community life while preventing the kind of misunderstandings and conflicts that could lead to discrimination or criminal activity. As evening settled more deeply over the city, Captain Chun reflected on the accumulated wisdom that had been gained through decades of community-focused law enforcement. Each case had contributed to understanding of how communities could address problems collaboratively, support vulnerable members, and prevent conflicts before they required dramatic intervention. The lights visible from her window represented not just individual households and businesses, but network of relationships and resources that had been strengthened through patient attention to community building and collaborative problem solving. The city had become more than the sum of its parts, developing the kind of social resilience that could address challenges while maintaining the stability and harmony that made community life possible. The quiet evening scene below her window told stories of transformation, healing, and growth that had occurred not through dramatic action, but through sustained attention to relationship building, mutual support, and the patient work of understanding and addressing underlying causes of social problems. The streets, buildings, and neighborhoods had become archives of memory, holding evidence of how communities could learn to care for themselves while maintaining the safety and order that law enforcement was designed to protect. Captain Chun understood that her role had evolved over the decades from individual law enforcement to institutional leadership that supported community capacity for addressing problems collaboratively. The view from her window encompassed a city that had learned to prevent crime through community building, to address conflicts through mediation and understanding, and to support all residents through networks of mutual care and assistance. The peaceful evening scene represented the culmination of countless individual cases that had been resolved not through punishment alone, but through education, support, and the gradual development of community wisdom about how to live together safely and harmoniously. The city itself had become an archive of memory, its bridges and corners, holding gentle echoes of stories that once demanded urgent attention but now rested in the quiet satisfaction of problems resolved in communities, strengthened through the patient work of those who understood that true safety came from mutual care and understanding. The final shift of Records Administrator Helen Welsh's 40-year career began in the pre-dawn darkness of a December morning, with frost creating delicate patterns on the windows of the basement archive facility, where she had spent the last 2 decades of her service. The building around her held its breath in anticipation of the day's work. But down in the depths of the records division, time moved differently, measured not in hours but in the slow accumulation of completed cases that had found their permanent rest in carefully organized storage systems. Helen moved through the familiar corridors with the reverence of someone who understood that she was the guardian of more than paper and files. Each storage unit, each carefully labeled box, each precisely organized filing system contained the final chapters of human stories that had once demanded urgent attention but now rested in the peaceful satisfaction of problems solved and justice served. With both firmness and compassion, the section she approached contained the most recently closed cases, investigations that had been completed within the past year and were now being transferred to permanent archive status. These cases represented the culmination of everything the department had learned about community policing, collaborative problem solving, and the patient work of building relationships that prevented problems while addressing their underlying causes. She paused at case 2024 to 1247. A comprehensive file documenting what had begun as reports of suspicious activity in Riverside Park but had evolved into a model program for addressing homelessness and food insecurity through community collaboration. The investigation had revealed that what neighbors had perceived as potential criminal activity was actually an informal network of mutual support among community members who were struggling with basic needs. Detective Michael Torres had approached the case by spending extensive time in the park, not conducting surveillance but engaging in conversation with the individuals whose behavior had prompted concern. His patient approach had revealed the dignity and resourcefulness of people who had organized themselves to share resources, provide mutual protection, and maintain community standards even while living in precarious circumstances. The resolution, documented in the case file, had involved working with social service agencies, city planning departments, and community organizations to develop permanent housing solutions and support services that address the underlying causes of homelessness while maintaining the sense of community and mutual care that the informal network had provided. The park now housed a community resource center that provided not just services for homeless individuals but programs for all residents who needed support during difficult periods. The case file concluded with photographs of the center's dedication ceremony, showing former homeless individuals working alongside community, volunteers, and city officials to create a space that served everyone's needs while maintaining the dignity and agency of all community members. Helen sealed the Torres case in its permanent storage container, reflecting on how it represented the evolution of law enforcement from reactive response to proactive community building. The case had transformed potential conflict into lasting collaboration, demonstrating how patient investigation could reveal opportunities for addressing social problems at their source rather than simply managing their symptoms. Moving to the next section, she reviewed Case 2024-0956, which documented the resolution of ongoing conflicts at Jefferson High School through the development of restorative justice programs that had become models for educational institutions throughout the region. The case had begun with reports of recurring vandalism and fights that had created tension between students, teachers, and law enforcement. School resource officer Janet Kim had recognized that traditional disciplinary approaches were not addressing the underlying causes of student conflicts and had worked with educators, parents, and students themselves to develop alternative approaches that emphasized understanding, accountability, and relationship repair rather than simple punishment. The program development had required extensive collaboration between law enforcement, educational professionals, social service providers, and community organizations that understood youth development and conflict resolution. The case file documented months of planning, training, and gradual implementation that had transformed the school's approach to discipline while improving both safety and academic achievement. The final reports in the case file showed dramatic reductions in disciplinary incidents, improved graduation rates, and increased student engagement in school governance and community service. More importantly, the restorative justice programs had been adopted by other schools throughout the region, creating a network of educational institutions that shared resources and strategies for addressing student conflicts constructively. Helen prepared the Jefferson High case for permanent archive, noting how it demonstrated the importance of institutional change rather than individual intervention in creating lasting solutions to recurring problems. The case represented years of patient work to change systems and cultures rather than simply responding to incidents as they occurred. The next case file contained documentation of the most complex investigation of the year, a financial fraud case that had revealed vulnerabilities in how elderly community members accessed financial services and made decisions about investments and charitable contributions. The case had begun with reports from several seniors who had been contacted by individuals claiming to represent various organizations and requesting personal financial information or immediate payments for supposed emergencies. Detective Linda Rodriguez had approached the investigation by working closely with elderly community members, financial institutions, and social service agencies to understand how fraudulent schemes operated and how they could be prevented through education and improved community protection networks. The investigation had required patience and sensitivity, as victims often felt embarrassed about being deceived and were reluctant to provide complete information about their experiences. The breakthrough in the case had come through community education programs that empowered potential victims with knowledge about how fraud schemes worked, while also creating reporting networks that allowed early detection of fraudulent activity. The investigation had led to arrests of multiple individuals operating coordinated fraud schemes, but more importantly, it had created lasting systems for protecting vulnerable community members. The case file concluded with documentation of ongoing education programs, improved coordination between financial institutions and law enforcement, and community support networks that provided both practical protection and social connection for elderly residents who might otherwise be isolated and vulnerable to exploitation. Helen reflected on how the fraud case demonstrated the department's evolution toward prevention and community empowerment rather than simply reactive investigation and prosecution. The case had created lasting change that would protect future potential victims, while strengthening community connections and mutual support systems. Moving deeper into the archive area, Helen approached the section containing cases that had been closed for several years but were being reviewed for their contribution to departmental training and community policing best practices. These cases represented institutional memory that would guide future officers facing similar challenges and would inform policy development for years to come. She selected case 20190334, which documented the transformation of the Riverside apartment complex from a source of recurring noise complaints and neighbor conflicts into a model of community cooperation and mutual support. The case had required sustained intervention over more than a year as Community Relations Officer Elena Vasquez worked with residents from diverse cultural backgrounds to develop shared guidelines for community living. The resolution documented in the case file had involved extensive cultural mediation, community education, and the development of resident leadership that could address conflicts before they escalated to require police intervention. The apartment complex now served as a resource for other residential communities facing similar challenges, with residents who had learned conflict resolution skills serving as trainers and mentors for other neighborhoods. The case file included annual follow-up reports showing sustained improvement in resident satisfaction, decreased police calls, and increased community engagement in local civic activities. The residents had not simply learned to avoid conflict, but had developed the kind of mutual support networks that made their community stronger and more resilient. Helen prepared the Riverside case for its final archive placement, understanding that it would continue to inform training programs and policy development even as it moved into permanent storage. The case represented accumulated wisdom about community building that would benefit future officers and residents facing similar challenges. The archive facility stretched around her in organized silence, containing thousands of cases that had found their peaceful conclusion through patient application of community-focused law enforcement principles. Each case represented not just completed investigation, but learning opportunities that had contributed to the department's growing understanding of how to address social problems collaboratively while maintaining public safety and community trust. Helen approached the section containing the oldest cases in the current archive, investigations that had been completed decades earlier but continued to influence departmental approaches and community relationships. These cases had established precedents for patient investigation, comprehensive intervention, and collaborative problem-solving that had shaped the culture of law enforcement in the community. Case 1987-0425 documented one of the earliest examples of what would become standard community policing practice, involving a series of break-ins at local businesses that had been resolved not just through arrests but through community collaboration that had improved security and economic vitality throughout the downtown district. The case had established patterns of business law enforcement cooperation that continued to benefit the community decades later. The resolution had involved working with business owners to understand their security needs while also addressing the underlying economic and social problems that had contributed to the criminal activity. The comprehensive approach had created lasting improvements in both crime prevention and community economic development. Helen sealed the 1987 case in its permanent storage container, recognizing it as foundational to everything the department had learned about addressing crime through community building rather than enforcement alone. The case represented institutional memory that would continue to inform law enforcement approaches for generations to come. As she prepared the final cases for archive storage, Helen reflected on the transformation she had witnessed during her 4 decades of service. The cases that now rested in peaceful completion around her represented a fundamental evolution in how law enforcement served community needs, moving from reactive response to proactive relationship building and collaborative problem solving. The archive facility itself had grown to accommodate this more comprehensive approach to documentation, preserving not just evidence of crimes and their prosecution, but records of community healing, relationship building, and the patient work of addressing underlying causes of social problems. The cases stored here represented institutional knowledge that would guide future generations of officers and community members working together to maintain safety, justice, and mutual support. Helen completed her final task of sealing and storing the most recently closed cases, ensuring that each one was properly labeled and positioned for long-term preservation. The climate-controlled environment would maintain these records indefinitely, preserving the wisdom they contained for future officers, researchers, and community members who needed to understand how patient, collaborative approaches to law enforcement could create lasting positive change. The morning light was beginning to filter through the small windows of the archive facility as Helen completed her shift. 40 years of service, concluding in the peaceful satisfaction of work well done and stories properly preserved. The cases around her rested in organized silence, their urgent demands long since transformed into the gentle weight of problems solved and community strengthened. Walking through the corridors of archived cases one final time, Helen understood that she was leaving behind more than employment. She was completing her role as guardian of institutional memory that would continue to serve community needs long after her retirement. The cases she had carefully preserved and organized would continue to inform and inspire those who came after her, providing examples of how law enforcement could serve not just legal authority, but community healing and mutual support. The archive facility settled into its daytime rhythm as Helen prepared to leave, but the stories contained within its organized storage systems would continue their patient work of education and guidance. Each case had found its permanent rest in the knowledge that justice, once served with patience and care, becomes eternal, providing lasting benefit to communities that learn to address problems collaboratively while maintaining the safety and harmony that made community life possible. In the profound quiet of the completed archives, every case had indeed found its final rest, sealed and stored in the peaceful knowledge that the work of justice continues not through dramatic action, but through the patient accumulation of wisdom about how communities can learn to care for themselves while maintaining the order and mutual respect that law enforcement exists to protect and preserve. The gentle weight of completion settled over the archive facility like snow over a landscape of peace, covering decades of human struggle and triumph with the serene satisfaction of problems solved, conflicts resolved, and communities strengthened through the careful application of law enforcement principles, guided by genuine concern for human welfare and community flourishing. Here, in the deepest silence of the archives, every question had been answered, every conflict resolved, and every story had found its peaceful ending in the accumulated wisdom of those who understood that true justice creates lasting peace through patience, understanding, and the tireless work of building communities where all members can live safely and thrive together in mutual respect and support. Maintenance Supervisor Thomas Kane descended into the sub-basement levels of the police headquarters that few people knew existed, areas that had been sealed and forgotten as the building expanded upward over the decades. His master keys opened doors that hadn't been used in years, revealing spaces that predated the modern filing systems, rooms that had once housed the original evidence storage when the building was first constructed in 1934. The air in these forgotten levels held a different quality, thick with the weight of time and the accumulated silence of stories that had found their rest so completely that they no longer needed documentation or preservation. These were the spaces where even memory itself came to rest, where the building held its deepest secrets not in files or photographs, but in the very mortar and stone that had witnessed decades of human drama transformed into lasting peace. Thomas moved through corridors lit only by his flashlight, past rooms where the original booking desk had once operated, where the city's first police officers had processed cases with methods that seem primitive now, but had been guided by the same fundamental commitment to justice and community safety that continued to motivate law enforcement today. The wooden floors creaked softly under his feet, as if the building were sighing with the contentment of work well done. In the furthest corner of this forgotten level, behind a door marked only with faded paint that read, "Storage 1934", Thomas discovered a room that contained the remnants of the building's earliest years. Wooden filing cabinets stood against the walls like silent sentinels, their drawers long since emptied, but their presence testament to the countless cases that had passed through this space during the decades when the building was young and the city was smaller, simpler, more intimate. The cases that had once been stored here were now part of history, their subjects long since passed into peaceful rest, their conflicts so completely resolved that they existed only as foundational experiences that had shaped how justice was understood and administered in this community. These earliest cases had established the precedents for patience, thoroughness, and genuine concern for community welfare that continued to guide law enforcement decades later. Thomas found an old desk tucked into an alcove, its surface worn smooth by years of use, its drawers containing only dust and the faint outlines where paperwork had once been placed with careful precision. This desk had witnessed the transformation of raw human conflict into documented resolution, had supported the careful work of officers who understood that their job was not simply to enforce laws but to maintain the social fabric that made community life possible. Sitting in the chair behind this forgotten desk, Thomas felt connected to the generations of public servants who had performed their duties with quiet dedication, knowing that their work would be measured not in dramatic moments, but in the gradual accumulation of trust, understanding, and mutual respect that made communities safe and peaceful. The silence around him was not empty but full, pregnant with the satisfaction of countless problems solved and conflicts resolved through patient application of justice tempered with mercy. The beam of his flashlight revealed details of the old storage room that spoke to different approaches to record keeping, when cases were documented by hand in careful script and filed in wooden cabinets organized by systems that prioritized accessibility over efficiency. These methods had required more time and personal attention, but they had also ensured that each case received individual consideration and that the human elements of legal problems were never lost in administrative process. Thomas discovered a cache of old photographs tucked behind one of the filing cabinets, black and white images that captured moments from the building's early years when the community was smaller and law enforcement officers knew most residents by name. The photographs showed community events, award ceremonies, and informal gatherings that spoke to a different relationship between police and residents, one characterized by personal connection and shared responsibility for maintaining community welfare. One photograph showed the building's dedication ceremony in 1934, with community leaders, police officers, and ordinary residents gathered to celebrate the completion of a structure that represented their collective commitment to justice and order. The faces in the photograph reflected pride and hope, confidence that this building would serve as a foundation for maintaining the kind of community where families could grow and thrive in safety and peace. Another photograph captured a community barbecue held in the parking lot behind the building, with officers and residents sharing food and conversation in an atmosphere of mutual respect and genuine friendship. These images spoke to an era when law enforcement was understood as community service rather than simply crime control, when officers saw themselves as integral parts of the neighborhoods they served, rather than external authorities imposed upon them. Thomas found himself moved by these glimpses into the building's early years, when the relationship between law enforcement and community was characterized by the kind of personal connection and mutual understanding that had been slowly rebuilt through decades of community policing initiatives. The photograph suggested that effective law enforcement had always been about relationship building, even when the methods and technologies were different. Moving deeper into the forgotten storage room, Thomas discovered remnants of the original. Booking systems, including ledgers where arrests and case dispositions had been recorded in careful handwriting. The entries in these ledgers revealed the same attention to detail and concern for due process that characterized modern police work, but they also showed how individual attention and personal knowledge had once supplemented formal procedures. The ledger entries documented cases that would seem familiar to modern officers: domestic disputes that required patient mediation, property crimes that demanded thorough investigation, and community conflicts that needed careful resolution through dialogue and understanding rather than enforcement action. The fundamental nature of police work had remained constant even as methods and technologies had evolved. Thomas read entries describing cases that had been resolved through community meetings, family conferences, and collaborative problem-solving. That involved multiple agencies and organizations working together to address underlying causes, rather than just immediate symptoms. These approaches had required more time and personal investment than modern efficiency standards might allow, but they had produced results that strengthened community bonds and prevented recurring problems. The forgotten room seemed to breathe. With the accumulated wisdom of all the cases that had been processed here during the building's early decades, when law enforcement was understood as one component of a larger community effort to maintain social order and mutual support. The silence was not absence, but presence, the peaceful satisfaction of work that had been completed so thoroughly that it no longer needed active attention. Thomas discovered a small alcove that had apparently served as a meditation or reflection, space where officers could process the emotional demands of their work. The space contained a simple wooden chair and a small table, where someone had left a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten reflections on the nature of justice, community service, and the psychological challenges of law enforcement work. The journal entries revealed thoughtful consideration of how police work affected both officers and community members, acknowledging the emotional burden of dealing constantly with human conflict while maintaining hope for resolution and healing. The writings demonstrated understanding that effective law enforcement required not just technical skills, but emotional intelligence, cultural competence, and genuine commitment to human welfare. Reading these private reflections, Thomas understood that the officers who had worked in this building during its early years had grappled with the same fundamental questions about justice, community, and human nature that continued to challenge law enforcement today. Their insights and wisdom had been preserved not in official records, but in the quiet spaces where honest reflection could occur away from the pressures of daily operations. The journal concluded with observations about the importance of maintaining faith in human capacity for growth, change, and mutual understanding, even in the face of constant exposure to conflict and criminal behavior. The final entry expressed hope that future generations of officers would continue to approach their work with patience, compassion, and unwavering commitment to serving community needs while maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. Thomas closed the journal and returned it to its resting place, understanding that he had discovered more than historical artifacts. These forgotten spaces contained the spiritual foundation of law enforcement work, the accumulated wisdom and dedication of those who had understood that their profession was really about maintaining the conditions necessary for human flourishing in community settings. The building around him seemed to settle deeper into its peaceful rest, secure in the knowledge that its purpose had been fulfilled through decades of faithful service to community needs. The forgotten rooms and abandoned storage areas held there secrets not as mysteries to be solved, but as gifts to be preserved for those who understood that effective law enforcement was really about love of community, love of justice, and love of the human potential for growth and redemption. Rising from the old desk, Thomas began his journey back through the forgotten levels toward the modern facilities above, carrying with him the understanding that the building's deepest foundation was not concrete and steel, but the accumulated faith and dedication of those who had committed their lives to serving others. The silence followed him like a blessing, the profound quiet that comes when all conflicts have found their resolution in the eternal peace that lies beneath even the deepest archives. The forgotten rooms would continue their patient vigil, holding their wisdom and readiness for those who needed to remember that law enforcement, at its best, was really about creating and maintaining communities where all residents could live safely and thrive, together in mutual respect and support. In these spaces deeper than memory, the very foundations of the building held stories that predated files and records, whispers of justice that had learned to exist in perfect silence, waiting to inspire future generations who would continue the endless work of transforming human conflict into lasting peace. Thomas emerged from the sub-basement levels as dawn broke over the city, carrying with him the blessing of those forgotten spaces where even memory itself had come to rest in the profound satisfaction of work completed, justice served, and communities strengthened through the patient, faithful service of those who understood that their highest calling was not to enforce laws, but to create the conditions where laws would become unnecessary, because people had learned to care for each other with the same dedication that the building's founders had brought to their vision of justice, tempered with mercy and service, guided by love.